O God, may your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for the peace and justice in our land, for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen.
Minister statements. Minister statements. Minister responsible for infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, I'm providing an update on the Prohibition Creek Access Road project to correct the public record, refute some information, and also address some of the recent allegations raised in this House about the procurement process for this project. First, the Prohibition Creek Access Road is, and always has been, advanced capacity building project. The goal is to help prepare businesses, workers, and residents to make the most of opportunities provided by the eventual construction of the entirety of the Mackenzie Valley Highway. Mr. Speaker, the Government of the Northwest Territories originally received federal funding to advance the design and construction of a 13-kilometer all-season road from Canyon Creek to Prohibition Creek, which is near Norman Wells, in June of 2020. That same month, the N.W.T announced this project would be procured through a public tendering process, following the receipt of a regulatory approval and completion of a final design. In November 2020, the N.W.T obtained approvals to advance the project. However, prior to initiating the procurement process, an environmental and engineering issue was identified at Christina Creek Crossing, which is approximately halfway to Canyon Creek and Prohibition Creek, which would require additional design and regulatory work. In an effort to keep the project and capacity building in the region moving forward, a decision was made to split the construction project into two phases. Phase 1, the construction, included building a 6.7-kilometer all-season road between Canyon Creek and Christina Creek. And Phase 2 was the construction would also include the remaining 6.3 kilometers from Christina Creek to Prohibition Creek. The N.W.T initiated a public procurement process for Phase 1 of construction in October of 2021. The amount of time that elapsed between securing regulatory approval and initiating the procurement process was caused by the engineering challenges at Christina Creek and the change in project approach that I just described. HRN Contracting Limited was the only business to submit a bid for Phase 1 construction through that public procurement process. Ultimately, the sole bid exceeded the available funding, and the procurement process was cancelled to re-evaluate the project's budget and financing. The Prohibition Creek Access Road project is one of several infrastructure projects that have experienced cost escalations recently. Large and systemic cost increases associated with COVID-19 response, supply chain issues, inflation, material labor shortages, rising fuel prices have had an impact on project costs. Following the cancellation of the public tender, the Department of Infrastructure engaged with Canada to revise the project delivery plan and very recently secured additional funding for Phase 1 construction, as well as design and engineering work required for the remainder of the 13-kilometer road, including the Christina Creek crossing. Mr. Speaker, I can also confirm that negotiated contract request from HRN for Phase 1 construction was also received following the cancellation of the public tendering process. This request is currently being advanced as per the provisions in the N.W.T's negotiated contract policy. HRN Contracting is a N.W.T business incentive policy registered business in the SATU, owned by a SATU beneficiary, and, as mentioned, was the sole bidder through this previous public procurement process. Mr. Speaker, while it would be inappropriate for me to discuss the specifics of a contract on the floor of this House, I can assure you that it's our intent to advance this project to see local, regional benefits maximized within the N.W.T procurement and our negotiated contracts policy. All of this to say, Mr. Speaker, this project has not been without its challenges. However, the allegations of nefarious dealings raised in the House are fundamentally untrue. It is our hope that procurement will be finalized in the near future. Construction on this important capacity building project can begin. We are hopeful that this can be as celebrated as the important milestone that it is, and that the years of work to get this point are not tarnished by these recent allegations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Minister statements. Minister statements. Minister responsible for housing N.W.T.
Mr. Speaker, partnerships are key to addressing the territory's housing crisis. Through partnership with Indigenous governments and communities, we are effectively finding housing solutions that recognize the unique needs of communities across the Northwest Territories. As we advance the Housing N.W.T's renewal strategy, I am pleased to report that these partnerships are already leading to real, meaningful work that will improve the quality of life for residents. When this House was last in session, I spoke about the Memorandum of Understanding on housing we had just signed with the Clecho government. Today, I am pleased to say that the Housing N.W.T has also signed a Memorandum of Agreement with the Sawtooth Secretariat Incorporated. The MOA provides a framework for intergovernmental cooperation on housing-related matters, including community housing planning, procurement, coordinated program delivery in the Sawtooth communities, and information and data sharing. Housing N.W.T recognizes that the Sawtooth region faces significant housing challenges. By working in partnership with the Sawtooth Secretariat, we will maximize federal funding, increase affordable housing for residents, provide training opportunities, increase economic activity in the region, and build the capacity of Indigenous governments and communities. The MOA sets a path for more collaboration, relationship between Housing N.W.T and the Sawtooth Secretariat, consistent with the Housing N.W.T's new approach to Indigenous partnership under the new mandate. Mr. Speaker, discussions between Housing N.W.T and other N.W.T Indigenous governments are also underway to develop cooperative agreements on housing. Last June, Premier Cochrane and I committed to a joint review of Housing N.W.T's policies and programs with participation of the Council of Leaders Housing Working Group, and it is already changing how we will be doing work with Indigenous governments. This is consistent with Article 23 of the Union Declaration that states that Indigenous people have the right to be actively involved in developing and determining social and other programs that affect them. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to say that through the renewal of Housing N.W.T and Programs and Policy Review, we are putting those words into action. We are increasing our engagement with Indigenous governments about the location and design of housing units. We are having open discussions with the Indigenous governments on how to maximize economic opportunities that come with housing construction and operation. We are also looking at new partnerships and innovative approaches for building housing across the Northwest Territories. Mr. Speaker, this collaboration work is helping us develop housing solutions that will benefit residents and the communities in which they live in. I'm pleased to see Indigenous governments seize an increasing role in housing, and that the federal government is now flowing distinction-based funding to Indigenous governments in the N.W.T. Housing N.W.T recognizes that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. Individual Indigenous communities and governments have different needs, capacities, and aspirations, and it is important that their housing solutions cater to their unique circumstances. Mr. Speaker, through collaboration and partnership with Indigenous governments, Indigenous organizations, and communities, we will be able to effectively address the N.W.T's housing crisis and meet our mandate commitment to increase the number of affordable homes and reduce core housing need in communities across the territory. Housing N.W.T will continue to build its relationships with Indigenous governments so that together we can find housing solutions that fit the needs of their residents and all the residents of the Northwest Territories. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to thank the staff of Housing N.W.T for working collaboratively with the Indigenous groups and helping us build our relationships. Must see, Mr. Speaker.
Thank Thank you, Minister. Minister statements, member statements, member statements, member for Thabatcha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, colleagues, it was my great honor to travel last week and early this week with the Premier and my colleague from Cam Lake to the Arctic Circle Assembly in Replies, Iceland. In an increasingly troubled world, Canada, and particularly Canada's North and its Indigenous people, need to work hard to strengthen our international bonds with the nations of the circumpolar world. I had the opportunity to sit on a panel examining the potential benefits of public-private partnerships that include Indigenous governments and organizations, and came away with a new and better appreciation of the full participation of our people in the modern economy. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my colleague from Hay River South, who as Deputy Chair of Caucus introduced motions last night in Committee of the Whole to implement the recommendations of two independent commissions, one to review MLA compensation and the other to recommend new electoral boundaries for the upcoming general election. With less than a year remaining until the next election, it is critical that we clarify the size of this House and its boundaries at the earliest opportunity. Residents, potential candidates, and our election management bodies need to know what the landscape looks like to make informed decisions in the run-up to next October. I don't intend to reflect on the decision that was made in the Committee of the Whole last night to reject the recommendation of the 2021 Electoral Boundaries Commission. But as caucus chair, I think it is crucial that the public understands what that decision meant and could mean. Had the motion carried, I would have introduced legislation next week to establish new electoral boundaries for the 2023 election. As it stands now, the status quo will remain. That leaves us with a number of ridings, particularly Yellowknife North and Mothwee, that are unacceptably larger than the average riding size. It remains to be seen whether this will result in a legal challenge. But as we all know, the boundaries have been challenged twice before. In 2015, the House accepted the recommendations of the Independent Electoral Boundaries Commission, and a challenge from the City of Yellowknife for more seats was unsuccessful. However, in 1998, in the infamous Friends of Democracy case, the Assembly, like last night, rejected the recommendations of the Independent Commission. The successful court challenge is why the number of MLAs from Inuvik and Hay River increased from 1 to 2, and why the number of MLAs from Yellowknife increased from 4 to 7. Electoral boundaries are very political and challenging to get just right. It's not just about the arithmetic. It's about how we organize our public government politically and constitutionally. Yes, Yellowknife has roughly half the population of the N.W.T. and less than half the number of seats in this House. But that doesn't mean Yellowknife is underrepresented in our government or at a disadvantage compared to the rest of the N.W.T. Far from it. I can't see where the time is. Where is it? It's right here. Oh. Mr. Speaker, could I seek unanimous consent to finish my statement?
Thank you, member for Thabatcha. The member is seeking unanimous consent to conclude her statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
Mr. Speaker, the Independent Commission's report wasn't perfect. It proposed a new and somewhat clever way to avoid adding seats to our legislature and avoid increasing the numerical influence of Yellowknife members in this House. In my view, the recommendations are the best possible outcome for small communities in the N.W.T. who are always struggling for greater influence in the halls of government. Some may think that last night's vote was the end of the matter for another 8 years. Mr. Speaker, I'd be surprised if that was the case. Last night's decision has effectively turned this matter, a very political matter, over the courts to decide for us. So far, history has shown that the courts tend to defer to the Legislative Assembly when it follows the advice of an independent commission chaired, by the way, by a sitting or retired Supreme Court judge. History also has shown that results can be very unpredictable when we ignore that advice and let the courts decide for us. I fear that we may find ourselves scrambling to implement court-ordered boundaries in the weeks and months leading up to the next election. Boundaries that could very well see more seats added to this House and more seats for Yellowknife, Mr. Speaker. I hope that I'm wrong on that, but in this uncertain world, political instability can spring up anywhere. As leaders, we need to see both the short-term and long-term implications of our decisions we make in this House, and do our best not to sleepwalk into constitutional issues of our own making. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Member statements. Member statements. Member for N.W.T.
Mr. Speaker, before I get started, I'd like to send thoughts and prayers home. Today they're laying my Uncle Henry Steen to rest, so thoughts and prayers with my family back home. Mr. Speaker, I've said in this House many times before, housing in N.W.T faces a major issues. Residents in my riding deal with the highest cost of living in the territory. We face overcrowding. We don't have enough homes, and the homes that we do have are in need of major repairs. In the N.W.T, the riding, as we know, 13% of our homes are overcrowded, 28% of our homes need major repairs, 25% of our homes are in core need. Mr. Speaker, I have constituents who have been put blankets on their floors in the winter so the snow wouldn't come in from the door or in the windows. So it's very confusing to me, Mr. Speaker, when residents in my riding want to purchase a housing unit, that the corporation doesn't fast-track these requests. These units in a housing corporation are barely maintaining with the wind and the snow blowing right through homes in the winter. If a resident wants to purchase a unit, shows interest of the housing corporation, should make it happen. It's been said in this House many times, the Northwest Territories is in a state of housing crisis. One solution to housing is to increase the number of our homeowners. So it's very troubling for me, Mr. Speaker, and my constituents in my riding that have been waiting in cases for years to advance home ownership options. I have a couple in Sax Harbour who've been waiting for 2 years since they submitted their complete application to the Minister and their staff in Nunavut on December 2020, an agreement and enter rent-to-own housing option. Since December 2020, the couple has been waiting and paying rent with no assurance that the housing corporation is under the rent-to-own agreement. My constituents are already highest cost of living in the Northwest Territories. Now local housing organization in Nunavut appears to be creating more financial hardship by delaying a long-term housing solution for this young family in Sax Harbour. Mr. Speaker, this is not only one example. There is a constituent in Paulatuck who have been waiting for almost 6 months for an answer for local housing organization. Mr. Speaker, this is unacceptable. I will have questions for the Minister of Housing at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for N.W.T. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, over the last week I had the opportunity to attend and speak on a panel at the Arctic Circle Assembly. Arctic nations from around the world discussed the unique challenges and opportunities faced by circumpolar nations in the face of climate change. Youth, Indigenous leaders, bureaucrats, politicians, researchers, and even royalty discussed an array of topics from Arctic biodiversity to green energy and mental health to critical infrastructure. Infrastructure development is a key circumpolar focus as the world continues to warm. In September this year, the Arctic ice covering the Northwest Passage reached its lowest levels on record. Researchers noted it was pretty close to ice-free in major channels. Mr. Speaker, 80% of the world's biodiversity is found in the Arctic and stewarded by 6% of the world's population, largely Indigenous people who have protected the land since time immemorial. Today, the world is looking to the Arctic for its resource wealth, efficient shipping routes for legal and illegal trade, and military presence in the continued assertions of Arctic sovereignty. In response, circumpolar countries are evolving both their responses to climate change and Arctic infrastructure. Countries like Iceland now extract 85% of their energy needs using renewable energy infrastructures with lofty goals of reaching 100%. The U.S. is pushing grant commitments to ensure 100% of Alaskans can access broadband internet. And Greenland is building 3 new international airports. The Arctic world is opening whether we want it to or not, and circumpolar nations are taking note and taking action. Arctic sovereignty is reliant on Arctic security, Mr. Speaker, and Arctic security is reliant on healthy communities. Healthy northern communities rely on security in healthcare, education, employment, food, and yes, housing. My biggest take-home this week, Mr. Speaker, is that Canada's Arctic infrastructure drastically lags behind the rest of the circumpolar world. In 2019, the federal government released its Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, but the policy lacked timelines, measures, and probably most importantly, Mr. Speaker, a budget to achieve its goals. While the way forward is a global collaboration and maintained Arctic zone of peace, Canada still needs social and economic infrastructure and healthy Arctic communities to maintain a seat at the table. We are not ready for the future of the Arctic. Arctic security and Arctic sovereignty needs social and economic infrastructure in the Arctic today. If Canada does not offer the much-needed Arctic infrastructure to build healthy communities in the Canadian Arctic, we know that someone else will. But at what cost, Mr. Speaker? I will have questions for the Premier at the appropriate time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Cam Lake. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Frame Lake.
Monsieur le President, I have some good news. Our government says it has sold the Mactung mining property, a zombie that just keeps on giving. The owner, North American Tungsten, went into creditor protection after N.W.T agreed to take on this operation under devolution. N.W.T allowed that company to keep the Mactung property as part of its financial security for its water license. Cabinet ended up buying Mactung for $4.5 million through a special warrant that bypassed the Legislative Assembly. Cabinet then spent almost $480,000 on a partial cleanup of that property, plus all the work trying to sell it, not including months of staff time. N.W.T hired a Southern consultant to submit a land use application to the Yukon government for an imaginary exploration program to hype the value of the property. Just after the May-June 2022 sitting, and with no advance notice to regular MLAs, Cabinet accepted a letter of offer from Fireweed Zinc Limited, a Vancouver-based junior mining company, to buy the property for a total of $15 million, subject to a number of strict conditions. 1, Fireweed pays the N.W.T the sum of $1.5 million on signing the letter of intent. 2, Fireweed will pay N.W.T an additional $3.5 million within 18 months of finalizing of a definitive agreement, apparently targeted before the end of this year. 3, Fireweed will pay N.W.T an additional $5 million upon announcing its intention to construct a mine at either the Mactung or any other portion of their mineral interests in the Yukon at McMillan Pass. And 4, Fireweed will pay N.W.T an additional $5 million upon announcing its intention to construct a mine at Mactung. I'm doubtful that N.W.T will ever get all the money and staff time back from the Mactung property, or that it will ever go into production. In terms of lessons learned, there doesn't seem to be any. I was hoping that N.W.T would recognize that mandatory financial security in forms that are irrevocable and liquid are required to ensure this kind of mess does not happen again. 8 years after devolution, N.W.T has failed to fix the problems with resource management left us by the federal government. It's past time that the Auditor General of Canada looks at the promise and practice of post-devolution resource management. I'll have questions for the Mining Minister later today. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Nivik-Twin Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, in this House and throughout the Territory, we've been talking about the need for a Mackenzie Valley Highway for decades. The Mackenzie Valley Highway has been in the planning stages since 1960, when the federal government was trying to advance the roads to resource programs. And to put this in perspective, my mother was 1. Status Indians were given the right to vote on July 1st, 1960. January 16, 1960, Gordie Howe became the leading goal scorer in the NHL. That's how long ago. The current proposed Mackenzie Valley Highway is just one part of what's needed for transportation in the N.W.T. The current proposed Mackenzie Valley Highway is 321 kilometers from Wrigley to Norman Wells. The estimated cost of this project to get the highway connected to Norman Wells was about $700 million in the last time it was made public. In 2018, the government started building the road from the north side down from Norman Wells to Wrigley, a 14-kilometer-long access road. So, Mr. Speaker, we still have 307 kilometers remaining to connect Norman Wells to Wrigley. We have the Inuvik to Tuk Highway that opened in 2017, but there's no all-season road connecting Inuvik to Fort Good Hope and Norman Wells. Mr. Speaker, we know roads bring prosperity to people and communities, and we know that residents in the Beaufort Delta rely on the Dempster Highway to gain access to the south, and this is largely a Yukon road. which is poorly and inadequately maintained. It also provides the exit route for residents and business to go spend their money outside the territory. Residents in the Beaufort Delta want access to the southern part of the N.W.T. People in the Delta are ready and willing to build a road connecting the Dempster Highway outside of Inuvik with a road to at least Fort Good Hope, where they can connect with the winter road in the winter months. Mr. Speaker, we have a major critical piece of infrastructure that can reduce the cost of living, increase investment and resource development, increase opportunities for tourism, trade, businesses from the north to the south of this territory, and yet N.W.T continues to advance this critical transportation corridor in a piecemeal. Mr. Speaker, what is the plan to connect the northern portion of the N.W.T to the southern N.W.T? Why isn't the GNW taking lessons learned from the Inuvik to Tuk Highway and extend this road further south? Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Thank you, Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes. The member is seeking unanimous consent to conclude her statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
Where are the community plans to support the work to advance this road to connect and open up the communities? It is the mandate of the 19th Assembly to advance development of the Mackenzie Valley Highway. The government states it will do that through establishing collaborative partnerships with Indigenous governments. I will have questions for the Minister of Infrastructure later today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Tunaday-Welladay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are running out of time in this Assembly to make good on our promises to improve the lives of our residents. I have had not the privilege of a membership in this House for as long as my colleagues, but that doesn't mean I have been idle in advocating for the needs of my riding of the Tunaday-Welladay riding. But I have had to look at what has been done before my time here to get a clear picture of the resources available. Budgets, action plans, policies, legislations, and a mandate have informed my work, and why I so often speak to how existing resources can be reprofiled to address pressing needs in our communities. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Minister of Finance tabled the 2023-24 capital estimates for $328 million, done from the average of $405 million over the last 9 years. As per the Minister's statement, this was done to bring a more realistic approach to infrastructure spending, as the N.W.T does not have the capacity to develop all the projects budgeted for in the previous years. I am not sure I completely agree with the Minister that this has created unrealistic expectations, does not encourage good planning, and necessitates an unnecessary large boring plan. After all, everyone and their dog knows of the N.W.T chronic deficit and infrastructure that is holding back our economic growth. Not only that, but until very recently, money was cheap to borrow. Of course, inflation, supply chain shortages has made these projects more expensive, but the initial investment were and continue to be sound. Mr. Speaker, let's talk about housing. I have made the serious challenge facing my constituents with home ownership and home ownership repairs my mission during this sitting of this House. I hope that the housing N.W.T minister is starting to get annoyed with me, because I am the desperate need to see how to get work on real solution that helps the people I represent. The capital estimates provides $35.5 million for housing N.W.T. We know that the policies of housing N.W.T are part of the problem in getting these valuable resources into our communities. I will again propose the Indigenous governments are a better position to make immediate use of these funds that are centralized, Yellowknife-based bureaucracy. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement.
Thank you, Member for Tunaday-Welladay. The member is seeking unanimous consent to conclude a statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are housing strategies and programs that work in all Tunaday-Welladay communities. Lutsuke is putting in trailers as we speak. Dennis and the Fort Resolution Métis Council are working towards completing the housing need assessment and assets inventory. The Yellowknife Denny are soon to realize customized housing designs through federal funding programs that will yield a fresh take on housing development in their communities. Mr. Speaker, I'm tired of seeing the best of intentions fail in the face of our housing needs. It's time to try a different approach, if only in the communities I represent. Let's take a small chunk of the $35 million and give it no strings attached to the Indigenous governments of Tuna-Day-Willity riding and help them move forward on their terms towards adequate and affordable housing in their communities. Mr. Speaker, I have questions for the Finance Minister. Thank you.
Thank you, member for Tuna-Day-Willity. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Hay-River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the last several years, we have seen major flooding severely impact not only the town of Hay River, but other communities along the Mackenzie and Liard rivers. There is considerable speculation and discussion as to why flooding appears more pronounced. Mr. Speaker, we were to have lessons learned after the devastating flood in Fort Simpson 2 years ago, and now, after the Hay River flood, it is apparent what we have not learned a great deal. This government sat back and provided limited to no preemptive analysis, indicators, or supports for emergency preparedness prior to any of that flooding. This government needs to develop systems and processes that protect lives, assets, and infrastructure. We need experienced and knowledgeable people at the table to provide guidance and planning. Mr. Speaker, as of today, I have not heard of or been made aware of any post-flood assessments or reports completed or that are underway by this government to address shortcomings from flooding that took place over the last 2 years, with the exception of a paper titled, and I quote, Analysis of Regional Flood Risk Planning and Evacuation Procedures Following the May 2022 Hay River Flood. This analysis was prepared by local Hay River resident Matthew Miller, who has studied and worked in water resource management, flood modeling, and municipal and transportation drainage design. I thank Mr. Miller for doing what this government has failed to do. Mr. Speaker, in addition to utilizing the services of those knowledgeable in floodplain management, flood preparedness, and emergency preparedness, we must look to include Indigenous knowledge of the area and climate history. Mr. Speaker, we also know the potential for flooding occurs well beyond community boundaries. This is not just a community issue. It is this government's issue, and it is an interjurisdictional issue as well. Therefore, we need to collaborate with our southern neighbours to talk watershed management. Mr. Speaker, for this government to place responsibility for flood management preparedness squarely on the shoulders of communities is wrong and unacceptable. Flooding is our reality, and it is now that we need to establish a group or team within this government to deal with flooding. We need to provide, in collaboration with communities and Indigenous governments, flood forecasting, flood preparedness measures, evacuation plans, mitigation measures for all communities on our river systems throughout the N.W.T. Anything less would be a failure on the part of this government. Mr. Speaker, I'll have questions for the Minister of MACA. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Hay-River South. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Great Slave.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 2020, the N.W.T expanded its Child and Youth Care Counselor Program, or CYCC, to provide more mental health supports for students and families across the territory. On February 21st of that year, the Yellowknife reported a total of 49 new counselor positions had been created in the territory for the program. The purpose behind this expansion was to enhance and increase mental health supports for children and youth. The job description for a child and youth care counselor states, the, quote, position is responsible for implementing specialized assessment and therapeutic programming. The CYCC is a member of the community counseling team and provides integrated and therapeutic mental health and behavioral programming in collaboration with school personnel and other health and mental health and social service professionals, end quote. But Mr. Speaker, I am concerned that a licensed specialist, such as a licensed psychologist or professional counselor, is not the requirement for this position, but rather it states typical qualifications of a master's in child and youth care, counseling, social work, or education. The minister committed on May 26th to increase the transparency of the acceptable equivalencies within the job description. Mr. Speaker, I recognize that it is hard to recruit experts and specialists to the north. However, these are the people who are dealing one-on-one with our vulnerable children and youth. I hear from residents that CYCC staff are mostly non-Indigenous, Southern social workers that are moving to northern communities, not trained counselors. The young graduates are coming here and providing frontline service to our children with little to no understanding of the true impacts of intergenerational trauma and the residential schools. Layers upon layers of trauma, grief, addictions, and mental health challenges. Mr. Speaker, it is no surprise that these workers don't stay long. They're paid less than teachers with less vacation time. The position isn't incentivized, and the lack of experience and commitment to the North is likely creating more harm than it's doing good. The Minister has stated in this House that the Department is planning to evaluate the program this fiscal year. Mr. Speaker, I seek unanimous consent to conclude my statement. Thank you.
Thank you, member for Great Slave. The member seeking unanimous consent to conclude her statement. Are there any nays? There are no nays. You may conclude your statement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, colleagues. The Minister has stated in this House that the Department is planning to evaluate the program this fiscal year. Mr. Speaker, how is the Department working with parents and school administration to evaluate the effectiveness of this service? What is the N.W.T doing to ensure our children receive the best possible counseling care available, given how they've consistently failed them for years now? And it's only gotten worse under this Cabinet and Minister. Mr. Speaker, I will be submitting my questions for the Department of Health and Social Services as a written question tomorrow. Given this minister's want to always shoot the messenger, I'm not interested in giving her a forum any longer. Thank you.
Order. Thank you, member for Great Slave. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A few weeks ago, the Department of Health and Social Services launched a survey talking about some proposed changes to the extended health and benefits. I gave it a quick glance and I was pretty happy. Mr. Speaker, multiple times in this House I've spoke about the essential gap of the working poor in this territory who do not have any extended health benefits. It appeared the department had a plan to means test extended health benefits and provide them to those people. My only feedback at that time was that the income threshold was a little low and we should perhaps increase it to provide this benefit to more people. But it came to my attention and was raised by a number of people that we were actually doing something else instead of just providing extended health benefits. We were removing the specified disease conditions that currently give people benefits. At first I thought this couldn't be true. I went back to the survey, I read it a number of times, and nowhere did it clearly state that this is what we were doing. Mr. Speaker, if we're going to consult on the question of whether to means test extended health benefits, that's fine. But if we're going to consult on the question of whether to provide extended health benefits at the expense of those who presently have specified diseases, that is a completely different question. Mr. Speaker, after I raised this in the media, the department reissued the survey and somewhat attempted to clarify what they were doing. But I still don't believe it is sufficient. And I'm getting many questions that I simply cannot ask, and the survey and engagement do not ask. Specific questions about how certain drugs work, how if you have cancer but you get this specific prescription drug, is that covered? Is that insurable? Very nuanced questions about how co-payment will work, questions about what if I have a specified disease and I can't find private health insurance. Mr. Speaker, I've sent these people to the department, and I am assured that the department is working with these people, but I think some much more targeted engagement needs to occur for all the people who presently have specified diseases and we're providing benefits to. That seems to be the main people we need to talk to. And then from my end, Mr. Speaker, even more questions need to be answered. How many people are we presently providing benefits to? This is not presented. Is this actually going to cost us money or save us money? Mr. Speaker, I suspect that this is a cost-saving measure in that providing benefits to people with specified diseases is quite expensive. And generally, just because you're poor doesn't mean you have a specified disease. I will have questions for the Minister of Health about a number of these things and hopefully get some answers to people out there about what it is we're actually doing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on May 28, 2022, David Roger Gargan passed away at the age of 71 years old. Dave was survived by his wife Jean his daughter Rianne, 2 sons, Joseph and Jay, his 5 grandchildren, 2 brothers, 3 sisters, as well as numerous great-grandchildren, nephews and nieces and cousins. David grew up in Jean Marie River and Fort Simpson. In his younger days, he enjoyed being on the land with his parents and siblings. Besides the traditional way of living, he loved to play sports, especially hockey. This is how I had the opportunity to meet him in 1992 as part of the Rangers hockey team. He was always early for the games and was chatting up the team, getting us ready to play whoever. As I got to know him, he was always talking about how much he enjoyed playing with his brother, Alex. They were dynamite together, always knowing what the other person was going to do. Mr. Speaker, as much as he enjoyed playing hockey, his true love and passion was his wife, Jean. She was his high school sweetheart. After every game, he would quickly get dressed and head out. One day, we asked what the rush was, and he said he had to get home so he could spend quality time with his better half. When we asked Alex, was David always like this? He said yes, especially when it came to his wife and children. Later, his love and passion was extended to include his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. David was a hard-working person who enjoyed all aspects of work he did. He took pride in getting things done right the first time. If he needed help, he would ask. I can tell you he was always respected by his co-workers and bosses. He worked hard to get things done in a timely manner. David was well known for his humor. He enjoyed telling stories, and he had a long list of stories. I can tell you there are many times when we lost track of time because of these stories. On top of his humor, there was one thing that stood out was David's generosity. He was willing to part with something, he would do it. Like the old saying, he would give his shirt off his back. This was David. I can tell you that he had a lot of friends all over the north, and he would be sadly missed by many. The Lafferty and Gargan family would like to extend their gratitude and appreciation to all those who come to pay their respects to David. Merci for showing him support, love, and compassion. The family are grateful for everyone's kindness, prayers, and words of comfort and support during this difficult time. Mr. Speaker, he'll be sadly missed by us all.
Thank you, Member for Nahende. Our thoughts and prayers are with the family and community at this time. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Acknowledgements. Acknowledgements. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions today are for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, on October 17th, 2022, the Premier said in this House, Northern security is not just about robust military presence. It is mostly about building strong, resilient communities through significant investment in critical infrastructure like roads, ports, telecommunications, and energy. Mr. Speaker, the Government of Canada released its Arctic Northern Policy Framework in 2019. This framework speaks to goals like ending poverty, eradicating hunger, reducing suicides, broadband for all, enhanced trade, and further goes on to specific infrastructure investments. So I'm wondering, can the Premier explain how the Arctic Northern Policy Framework will advance critical infrastructure in the N.W.T, like the roads, ports, and telecommunications and energy that she spoke of on the 17th, and how the federal government plans to implement this framework with no timelines or budgets associated with it? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The MLA is absolutely correct. The Arctic and Northern Policy Framework was released in 2019, and then after that work was done, the next step was to be implementing the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework. Sadly to say, the federal government, we've met twice in this government on that with the federal minister, perhaps due to COVID, perhaps other reasons. However, it's important. The Arctic and Northern Policy Framework is not just about making sure that every funding that goes to the Northwest Territories is identified in there. That policy framework was to address the huge gaps that we have in the Northwest Territories compared to our southern neighbours. We all know that. We know that we're lacking in supports and services compared to the south, and you only have to drive south and see what they have compared to what we have here. So I am hopeful. The member is also right. There is no budget. There's no strategic plan to develop for it. And I also have the same concerns. A lot of time and resource went into developing that framework, and I don't want to see it sit on a shelf. I don't want to see every money that comes to the Northwest Territories just get labeled under it. It needs to be to address the gaps that we have, and I'm hoping that the federal government would hear that and that the federal government will start implementing significant funding to the Northwest Territories so we have the same quality of living that every Canadian should be entitled to. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just this past Monday in Iqaluit, there was a collection of policymakers that got together in order to discuss this very thing, Arctic sovereignty, and that was in response to a $4.9 billion investment from the federal government. So these conversations are still happening, and having this conversation twice over the course of this assembly, it just isn't enough. We need more attention from the federal government here in the Western Arctic. And especially when here, any N.W.T. resident could tell you that the North definitely felt things in a more heightened way over the course of COVID. So our need for these items were just heightened in COVID. So really our conversations should have been more frequent and louder, in my opinion, Mr. Speaker. My next question is, the Premier explained on May 30th, 2022 that the Council of Leaders is the regional implementation body for the Arctic Northern Policy Framework. And so I'm wondering if the Premier can identify the priority areas the Council of Leaders is undertaking with respect to Arctic security, and if there is a timeline and budget for the Council of Leaders to advance Arctic security in the N.W.T. that can be shared with this Assembly. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Minister, Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll start with a little bit of a clarification. Absolutely, the member is correct. We need to be lobbying the federal government for this on a regular basis. The Council of Leaders table has met with the minister, the federal minister, Minister Vandell, twice in this assembly. However, myself and ministers have constantly met with the federal government, and every time I meet with the federal ministers, applicable ministers, I bring this up because why do the work if it's not going to be addressed? So the Council of Leaders did identify gaps. They identified their priorities. In the last meeting with the Minister Vandell, the Council of Leaders agreed that that table would be the table that would implement it because they were the Indigenous governments and us that developed the framework. So I believe that last meeting was in September, late September. And the issues that were identified by the Council of Leaders were mental health and addictions, community-based treatments, infrastructure. They identified housing, clean energy, transportation and governance, and the economy, green economy and remediation. I do want to say that by working together, all Indigenous governments in the GNWT and the federal government, I do have to give credit where credit's due, has put a phenomenal amount of housing money in this government that has gone to all Indigenous governments and the GNWT, and that shows what can be done when we work together. However, we do need to identify next steps. We've identified our priorities at that table, but the federal government needs to work with us to identify how we get there. It cannot be a unilateral decision on what happens next. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. I'll just be cognizant of the time. 2 questions asked and answered in almost 5 minutes, so let's shorten up the preamble, please. Member for Kamloops.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess I'm trying to get all my words in this week after 2 missed days. In March of this year, Mr. Speaker, the 3 Northern Premiers wrote to the Council of Federation to express concern with Canada's Arctic defence and security and requesting Arctic sovereignty and security become a standing agenda for these meetings. And so I'm wondering if the Premier can explain how the federal government responded to the issues of the Northern Premiers, how the Northern Territories are working together to advance the Northern interest in Arctic security, and if the Intergovernmental Council is involved in those conversations as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Kamloops. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also wanted, this is a passion of mine as well, so I will try to be more concise on this one. The three territories did work together to develop a pan-territorial chapter, things that we have in common across the territories. And so from that chapter, we've been lobbying, the three of us, I hate to say it, maybe inappropriate, but I call us the dynamic trio. The three premiers have been lobbying the federal government together to actually lobby for the needs of all territories, because they're similar in some areas, different in others. So again, we've been meeting not only with the federal government, we've been carrying our message nationally and internationally at any table that we can get at. We actually bring forward the needs of the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework because it needs to be addressed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Final supplementary, member for Cam Lake.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that this government is being consistent in asking for more money. But in 2022, the federal budget announced a total of $8 billion new funding over 5 years in response to the defense policy from the federal government. There was $40 billion to modernize NORAD over the next 20 years and $4.9 million to update aging North American air defense systems. So I'm wondering if the Premier can explain how the federal budget that has been set and has been allocated to Arctic security will impact the N.W.T. specifically, and what can we expect to see happen in our territory as far as Arctic security? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Cam Lake. Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member again is right. The federal government is implementing military defense mechanisms and a budget associated with the safety of the Arctic, and I support that. We do need to support the safety issues, but I've been adamant in saying that Arctic safety is not just about missiles or boats in the sea. It has to incorporate Arctic sovereignty, and that means addressing our gaps. We need to build our economy. We need to close our infrastructure gap. We need telecommunications. We need ports. We need all of the things, like I had said, that contribute to healthy and vibrant growth in our communities. Because if we don't have communities, then we're open land. And that is not what I want to see. So they have to go hand in hand. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on October 5th, 2022, I sent an email to two ministers requesting for integrated case management services for two constituents. These constituents are a couple who are experiencing homelessness and barriers to attaining income assistance. In talking with the housing minister about this, she referenced a housing strategy that has not been tabled yet. I'd like to ask the minister, is she okay with Norman Wells, Hay River, Inuvik, Yellowknife, and Betchico having a homeless shelter and allowing Fort Smith to go without one? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and just thank you to the member for that question, but just a correction, Norman Wells does not have a homeless shelter. We are working with the Indigenous groups throughout the Northwest Territories to try to find solutions on how to deal with people who are experiencing either homelessness and do have challenges at the ground level. We don't have integrated case management in the smaller communities. Therefore, we try to work very strongly and very strategically with the employees at the ground level, working with the local housing authority. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I asked for a joint response from the Housing Minister and the EC and E Minister to assist with this dire situation that this couple is in. I have only received bureaucratic answers with no solutions, as usual with this minister. When will the minister provide actual solutions for my constituents and direct her staff to be more compassionate to vulnerable and homeless people? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in respect to the member's riding, housing has worked very collaboratively with the Indigenous groups. Within that riding, we have been able to put more housing units on the ground as well too. But not only that, just working with the individuals and having to try to find housing solutions. Housing cannot solve the housing crisis on our own. We need the partners at the table. Housing has been working very closely with the members, Indigenous governments within her riding, and we continue to work in collaboration together and trying to find housing solutions at the local community level. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Thabacha.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it seems there's a lack of compassion and urgency to the suffering of vulnerable people experiencing homelessness. I would like to ask the Minister, where is the compassion from this government and from her department? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for Housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question as well. This is an area that we have taken a different turn within the housing portfolio as well, and we're starting to find that working with the nonprofit organizations throughout the Northwest Territories do need a lot more support and a lot more training and dealing with their clientele. Housing has been working throughout the Northwest Territories, providing those services agreement and trying to come up with solutions as well. Within a portfolio, we are looking at further programming. Just one at the top of my head is the Canada Housing Benefit that we did increase. It first had started off at $200,000 and now we're at $2.5 million. And with that, we're able to really understand the housing need and the crisis throughout the Northwest Territories. But we continue to work together with the communities to try to find further solutions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Sir, final supplementary. Member for Thabacha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as stated earlier, I sent an email to the Housing Minister on October the 5th, which was 14 days ago. That's 11 business days. When will the Minister provide a response to that email? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Thabacha. Minister responsible for Housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I'm receiving the responses back from the department, they often go back for further analysis as well too, and looking at what we possibly can have at the ground level, which is honestly very limited. We try to look for what resources do we actually have in order for us to be housing people. And we have just a limited amount of housing units in the Northwest Territories. We also have a wait list that is out there as well. We also deal with women and children and families who are either returning back from treatment, dealing with domestic violence, and we are trying our best to be more of accommodating to the people of the Northwest Territories. But I really would like to, like I further said, is that we need to be working as a community and together and with all stakeholders at the table in order for us to really address these strong housing needs and issues throughout the territory. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in addition to my statement today, N.W.T. housing crisis, we're facing a health crisis also. But it stems living together in overcrowded units. It's really drawing a lot of hurt and hardship between families because there are just not enough homes. Mr. Speaker, I referenced since we started sitting in for this 19th Assembly, 15 times I've made member statements in this House in regards to the housing issues that we do have in the territory. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister plan to reduce overcrowded homes in the N.W.T. riding? And when we could work together for that? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for N.W.T. Minister responsible for Housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member from N.W.T. as well too. I understand where all the members are coming from as well too, and with the portfolio, we're trying very hard to find strategies and be very strategic on our investment for the Northwest Territories, and also investing fairly and recognizing that that all of our people throughout the Northwest Territories are facing a housing crisis. For the members riding, as of to date, we are going to be investing $9.2 million for the 23-24 government. We have $8 million that is going to be completing 8 public housing units and repairing 9 housing units. We have $1.2 million for home ownership repair program for private homeowners and minor repairs for N.W.T. units. I would also like to include, Mr. Speaker, that Paulatuck will be receiving 4 units, Tuck will be receiving 4 as well, Uluhuktuk will be receiving 2. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the Minister for that. I'd like to, how many people are currently homeless under the housing in my riding in N.W.T, Mr. Speaker? What's the plan to increase housing options for these people? Are we able to take off through the CMHC, able to give these houses away like we planned? And we're waiting one couple in Sachs Harbour for 2 years now to get that program out. So how do we get them to get that house off the books from CMHC to provide a new house in Sachs Harbour, to be able to provide for our younger generation that's having families but having to stay with their parents? This is unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. We need an answer for this, and sooner than later. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for N.W.T. Minister responsible for housing and N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for his question. With the housing portfolio, there's also the community housing plans, and I know it might seem kind of minor to the member, but we need to come up with a strategy at the community level in order for us to be working and trying to address the housing needs strategically at the ground level. These community housing plans are also lobbying documents for the federal government and trying to acquire further funding. There was an announcement for the distinction-based funding. I don't have the number in front of me of how much the member's riding has received, but I am interested in looking at those housing sales, Mr. Speaker. I also would like to see transfers of those units if they're single-family dwelling. I would like to see those and further look at those files as well. I don't have the information at the tip of my fingers right now, but I need to see the rate and condition of those units and the possibility of and options for transfer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that I know that with the N.W.T. Regional Corporation received $76 million last year for housing. Is this minister working with the N.W.T. to try to work together to combine funding to get houses into the communities? And then my last one is, or not my last one, but the people in Sachs Harbour, for say, they paid 2 years into a program that they were told that they had the unit, but there was the 2 years that they paid the rent without the house being signed over. Will the minister commit to that couple once that verbal commitment was made by the N.W.T. Housing Authority? That money they paid for the last 2 years goes into the purchase of that unit. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for N.W.T. Minister responsible for housing and N.W.T.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker. I would like to take a look at those files as well that the member is referencing with the 2 years with that agreement, and I would like to see what is the current update on them. So I'd like to encourage the member to send that over to my office. And also, housing does work very closely with the N.W.T. Regional Corporation as well too. They just recently met September 22nd. I don't have those further details, but I can follow up with the member and give him an update. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that information's been sent over 2 years, and it's been sent numerous times to the minister's office, not to her office per se, to the N.W.T. Housing Authority. We need some answers here. We got people on waiting 2 years now. And of all places, I mean, we don't have many houses in Sachs Harbour. We need more housing units in Sachs Harbour. We take this one off, we give it to them. They're paying for it, but at the end of the day, they're going to be able to take that house and get another house under CMHC, because we're only allotted so many units in the community. So that's going to be a big help. But the minister has to make sure that I'm asking her to get this done and there's 2 of them that I'm really pushing for, and the information's already there. So she could get her staff in Nunavut to do that, because we're waiting for an answer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for N.W.T. Minister responsible for housing and N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will follow up with the Nunavut office and with those specific files and get back to the member. My seat, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, member for Nunavut Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Infrastructure. Can the Minister describe the status of the relationship with all Indigenous governments situated along the proposed Mackenzie Valley Highway route on this project? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes, Minister responsible for infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the work we're currently focusing on, which is the 321-kilometer alignment to Wrigley to Norman Wells, have established a MOU for collaboration on the projects with SATU Secretariat Incorporated. We also have a contribution agreement with SSI and the PKFN for work under this project. We also have a memorandum of understanding with the PKFN for their consideration on the project collaboration. We also have provide contribution funding to Norman Wells and Toledo Renewable Resource Councils for some traditional work. So, Mr. Speaker, we are working with the Indigenous groups. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So nothing north of Norman Wells. Okay. Is the work to advance the road connecting Norman Wells and Wrigley on budget and on track? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes, Minister responsible for infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for her question because I think that's really important to get this out there. So in 2018, the Department of Infrastructure obtained $140 million in federal support under the National Trade Corridor Fund to be able to support things like the environmental assessment, some of the planning studies for the portion of the Mackenzie Valley Highway from the communities of Wrigley to the Wells, which again is a distance of 321 kilometers, as well as the construction of the Great Bear River Bridge and the Mount Gaudette Access Road. We also have successfully obtained funds to be able to construct phase 1 of the Prohibition Creek Access Road, which is about $25.5 million for construction of that phase. The next critical milestone, Mr. Speaker, in the process of submitting for our developers assessment report, which we anticipate to be submitting to the Mackenzie Valley Environmental Impact Review Board early 2023. So following the completion of this critical community engagement and Indigenous traditional knowledge work that is currently underway, we anticipate the EA to take approximately 2 years, followed by approximately 1 to 1.5 years to obtain all the regulatory permits for construction. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, residents and business in the Beaufort Delta are ready and willing to build a road south and undertake the work required to develop community plans to get communities ready. In the Beaufort Delta, that's what they do. They build roads. So can the minister identify the length of the road and the budget, even if it's a past budget that might have been an estimate budget, required to connect the Inuvik to Fort Good Hope? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes, Minister responsible for infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I respect that the member was able to give me a heads up. However, that heads up was just not enough time to be able to go back and get a figure from the department. So I'd like to get back to the member for this one because this is something of interest to me and perhaps you too, Mr. Speaker. I mean, we've talked about this in the past, so I think, you know, we can get back to the member. Yeah, I'm just not ready to ballpark a figure like this given some of the cost escalations in all our other projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary. Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I don't think it's just for us. I think it's for the whole of Northwest Territories. I think it's going to be a great thing if this happens, if this comes to life in my lifetime, because it's been since 1960 that it was first talked about, like I said. Mr. Speaker, can the minister commit to investigate the feasibility of building the Mackenzie Valley Highway from the Inuvik south to connect to Fort Good Hope and get that work started as well as while they're working on it? Let's get some money rolling in. Let's get this part of the highway done. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes, Minister responsible for infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think the members can be happy with my commitment on this to be able to look at investing the feasibility study. The long-term vision for the Mackenzie Valley Highway has always been to connect communities from all the way up the valley, up from Wrigley, all the way to Tuktoyaktuk with the all-season road. You know, reducing our reliance on some of our existing network of winter roads, which are increasingly at risk to some negative impacts of climate change. So, Mr. Speaker, I see the members quite happy right now, so if she's happy, I'm happy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Mumphy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I raised earlier this setting that many elders are having difficult time with significant debts to the Housing Corporation from many, many years ago. In many cases, the elders are not aware of why the debt is owed. The Housing Corporation is in many cases garnishing their income, which means the Housing Corporation takes a significant chunk of every modest paycheck they make. Mr. Speaker, while the minister commit to direct her officials to immediately enter a state of execution of existing garnishee orders registered against elders by the Housing Corporation, so they can keep more of what little they already make, until such time as her officials can develop a program to allow people to apply for forgiveness of their housing debts. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Mumphy. Minister responsible for Housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question as well. And I'm assuming that these are debts that are for home ownership, and that we had established these units. These were access units and 15-year agreements that were established over 20 years ago. That was an agreement that we did have with CMHC at that time. I'd have to follow up with the member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Mumphy.
It's also the arrears for housing, public unit. So can the minister commit to working with integrated service delivery to ensure that low-income families at risk of evictions are fast-tracked to the supports and services they need, which includes access to legal aid programs, financial planning, childcare, career and employment support, healthy living, and healthy choices? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Mumphy. Minister responsible for Housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question as well. And I just wanted to speak about the community housing support worker that we did have in the members' riding, as it was a pilot project a couple of years ago. And we are still interested in reestablishing that program because it was quite successful. But that is followed up with the Clecho housing working group, where housing is participating. I will request a further update on where this position is, because it's exactly what the member is requesting is something like integrated case management, wraparound services, and this is exactly the responsibility of this position. It would greatly support her riding, or her community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Mumphy.
Mr. Speaker, okay, this is regarding the bilateral agreement. So, Mr. Speaker, many of our Indigenous governments have a keen interest in increasing the housing stock of their regions and communities. In its new mandate, the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation commit to pursuing government-to-government relations with Indigenous government, as she mentioned. This is a welcome change towards developing bilateral relationship. Most of our Indigenous government are very interested in taking responsibility and taking over housing assets from the N.W.T. I want to ask the minister, what is the framework currently being used to transfer housing stock from the N.W.T to Indigenous government? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Mumphy. Minister responsible for Housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. Indigenous partnership is a priority that I do have within the portfolio, and we have made great success in developing those relationships. And this year we had signed an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding with the Clecho government in regards to housing for us to better support and come up with stronger solutions, and also lobbying the federal government for addressing the housing crisis in the members region as well. And I'm just looking forward to providing the member with a further update on the meeting that was just recently had in September. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final short supplementary, member for Mumfui.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, with that in mind that she just mentioned, to have a relationship with the Indigenous government, then what I would like to see this government do then is that transfer the 14 units that the Clecho government are asking for. I would like to see that happen, if they're going to continue having a good working relationship with the Indigenous government. So the federal government seems interested in supporting housing stocks being transferred to Indigenous government. Is the N.W.T receiving assistance in facilitating these transfers? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Mumfui. Minister responsible for housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In a recent bilateral that we did have with the Clecho, there was mention of the 13 units, but it was not on the agenda. The Clecho government did receive distinction-based funding as well, and they were looking at a housing delivery coming into the community, but also looking at housing repair. We do have the working table with the Clecho government, and I don't have a further update on what their priorities are at that table, but housing is working with them very closely to address the housing needs in the Clecho region. Must seat, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Tuna-Day-Welday.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question today are for the Minister of Finance. The capital estimates allocate some $35 million to housing in N.W.T. As I've said many times, I am firm in belief that this money would be better spent through contribution agreements with Indigenous governments. Does the Minister agree that Indigenous governments in the Tuna-Day-Welday riding are efficiently and effectively managing their financial resources with respect to housing programs and strategies? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Tuna-Day-Welday. Minister responsible for finance.
Minister Speaker, if I can redirect that to the Minister of Housing, it's housing questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Premier. Minister responsible for housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to the member's question, I was kind of confused there for a minute there that the question was for the Department of Finance, but it's not my role to be telling the Indigenous groups how to spend their money within their riding, but as a housing minister, we have been working with the members' riding very closely, and for them to be successfully receiving co-investment federal funding and the rapid rehousing initiative funding as well to the members' riding as well. And he did see a number of units that were delivered to Let's OK, and that the conversation between the housing and the Indigenous governments in the members' riding it continues, and I look forward to further successes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Tuna-Day-Welday.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I directed that question to the Minister of Finance, but then I think the Premier spoke up and passed that on to housing, so I'm not sure if the Minister of Finance was able to speak to this question. Thank you.
Once it's redirected to another minister by the Premier, the Minister of Housing is going to direct your questions to her. Minister. So, yeah, it's really no question. Member for Tuna-Day-Welday.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I guess what I'm trying to get at is that, I've been trying to really advocate for housing for our people in our communities in the Tuna-Day-Welday riding. And, I've been trying to really work with the Minister of Housing Corporation on how we could address and build relationships with Indigenous governments. You know, I see these MOUs are good ideas, but, you know, they only go so far. And I don't hear no commitments from this government at all in trying to fix these problems we're having in our community. So will the minister work with the same Indigenous governments and the cabinet colleagues to transfer housing projects scheduled for 2023-24, along with their budget resources to Indigenous governments' housing programs through a contribution agreement? Thank you.
Thank you, member for Tunde Welde, Minister responsible for Housing and N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question as well, too. I'm not sure which units that are in question to be transferred over to the community, but I'm interested in working with the Indigenous governments, and if this is something that is a request that the Indigenous governments are interested in doing, I would like to further that conversation, and if they would be able to identify the units to me, I'd like to see what condition they're actually in. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, member for Tunde Welde.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, you know, this issue is really not going to go away. I mean, we had 50 years to get our act together to provide housing for people here in Northwest Territories. And in the minister's statements earlier, he talks about the MOU and the great success she's made in the Sahtu region. But the chiefs are very clear, and when I heard on cabinet radio on August 26th on the SSI meeting, chiefs made it very clear, bring your checkbook. So what we're saying now, Mr. Speaker, is that we want to see the minister to come to our communities and look at building new relationships so we can improve housing in our communities. Right now it's not working, so I'm just saying that, Mr. Speaker, that we have an opportunity to build a new relationship, and I hear from the minister, but I don't see no action. Thank you.
Thank you, member for Tunde Welde, Minister responsible for Housing and N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question as well, too. And you know, I disagree with the member. You know, housing has been working with the Indigenous governments throughout the Northwest Territories, and we're trying to do things differently, and really looking at the community's perspective on what is required at the community level. What is it that the community would like to construct? What type of housing would they like to enter and to get into? I just wanted to comment for the co-investment. The Yellowknife's Dene have received $19 million in co-investment funding. Housing has also provided $133,000 to work on their community housing plan as well too, and also looking at the rapid housing initiative for DEDA and DELO. Housing is at the tables with the Indigenous governments and trying to find these solutions. The Indigenous governments are the drivers of housing projects in a smaller community. We are there to support them, and if there's an opportunity to be flying and getting into the members' riding, I am open to be doing that as well. I did travel to YELLOWKNIFE over the summer, and I did see the significant need of housing at the ground level, but I'm willing to be traveling into the community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, member for Tunde Welde.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I heard this. I've been around for a while, and 50 years Housing Corporation was here, and we're still talking about that today, and our communities are still suffering from housing repairs, and I produce documents here showing that we have problems in our community. We have problems with cockroaches in our communities. We got big problems, but yet we can't seem to be fixing these problems. And what I'm hearing from Indigenous governments is that they're really tired of Housing Corporation's policies and bureaucratic red tape. So we're going to have to look at new ways of building a new relationship. So the sooner the better on that. That was just a statement, no question. Thank you.
Thank you, member for Tunde Welde. Give the minister opportunity to respond. Minister responsible for Housing and N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I just wanted to also comment on our policies and programming that is actually being reviewed right now by the Council of Leaders Working Group, where that consists of Indigenous leaders throughout the Northwest Territories as well. I'm not sure if Tunde Welde is participating in those meetings, but I can provide the member with an update, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, member for Hay River South. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for lessons to be learned, one must conduct a review and assessment of the event. In this case, it's flooding. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister of MACA confirm if there will be any follow-up analysis in the form of reports prepared by this government on the flooding in both Hay River and Fort Simpson, and if so, when can we expect to see those reports? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Hay River South, Minister responsible for Municipal and Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, thanks to the member for the questions here. Work is underway to conduct an after-action review of the 2022 flood and the 2021 flood. Once completed, the recommendations will be public. MACA has worked with ENR and hydraulic experts to examine the cause of the 21 and the 22 flood, and we'll be doing the same thing with the 22 flood. The work has been included to include the production of flood extensive planning or mapping of it, the flood zones and that, and this information will be provided to the communities of Town of Hay River and N.W.T First Nation in October, so at the end of October. In regards to the after action plan, unfortunately, we will not be able to get it's being done, but it will not be done until after late next year because we have to be, as part of it is the flood recovery plan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister confirm, other than raising buildings, has the department started to work towards identifying flood mitigation measures for Hay River that would include watershed management, flood mapping, establishing flood risk elevations, berms, dredging, drainage, embankments, stabilization, dewatering equipment, and an action plan? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Hay River South, Minister responsible for MACA.
Thank you. Yes, so the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs is working with the Town of Hay River, N.W.T First Nations, and the federal government on how we can address these certain situation mitigation and work with them to get this work done. So we're in the process, we're working with them, and again, it takes a little bit of time and it's a little back and forth, but we are working with the town and N.W.T First Nation as well as the federal government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister confirm if any specific mitigation measures have been identified for Paradise Valley, the Corridor, Old Town, West Channel, and the New Town? We don't know what's going to happen next year, so I think we have to take some decisive action and prepare for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Hay River South, Minister responsible for MACA.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The answer is yes. We are working on that. We're working with the town. There's a lot of discussion again. We're also working with the federal government, and we're trying to find and identifying funding sources to address this mitigation, to make sure that this situation doesn't happen again, or we're prepared for if it happens or floods happening again. So we are working with the town as well as N.W.T First Nation on this very topic. And again, like I said, we're reaching out to the federal government and trying to find additional funds and our funding sources to deal with this matter. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary, Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I hope the Minister and the Department isn't putting all this work on the shoulders of the community, because they just don't possess the resources required to undertake this assessment, review, evaluation. So can the Minister confirm if there is a communication plan in place that is directed at disseminating and gathering information to and from residents on mitigation solutions for specific areas in Hay River? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Hay River South, Minister responsible for MACA.
Thank you. I know the first part No, we're not downloading onto the town or the N.W.T First Nation. We're working together collaboratively to do this. As per the part of the question in regards to the public information component, yes, that's part of the plan. That's part of the strategy that we're working on. We're making sure that this information is public, and we're making sure residents here in the town in the reserve are able to provide this information moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. My questions for the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment. The news release on the sale of Mactung property says that N.W.T will get $15 million. Can the Minister tell us whether we have received the initial $1.5 million from Fireweed Zinc, and where are we at with a definitive agreement when another $3.5 million may be coming our way? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can confirm that the initial $1.5 million payment from Fireweed Metals was received in June of this year. And further to that, Mr. Speaker, they were given the 18 months in order to do some due diligence work. I understand that there has been some work done over the last exploration season this past spring, summer, and that we are expecting that the final agreement will then be signed, or rather the purchase agreement will be signed, which will trigger the further payment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that. Details on the agreement for the sale of this property seem to be quite scarce. Can the Minister confirm whether the terms of sale will be binding on any future owners of the property in the case where Fireweed Zinc decides to sell the property or it loses it? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for ITI.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, both the letter of intent as well as the asset purchase agreement would be binding on future owners should Fireweed Metals not be the owners of the property. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that information. It's not clear who may be responsible for the residual junk at the property and any closure and reclamation that might be required. Can the Minister tell us whether our government is on the hook for any responsibility and liability for the current condition of the property? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for ITI.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The property is actually relatively undeveloped, and as such, well, I mean, I can't speak for what the company may have decided upon, but I can certainly say that the N.W.T is selling the property as is, and that was part of the that will be part of the asset purchase agreement. That all the liabilities, to the extent that there are any, will be transferred, and that, of course, is the basis on which the agreement is moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that. I'm happy to send her some pictures of the junk when we're finished here, but in my view, the Cantong and Mactung saga is another example of post-devolution mismanagement of our resources. When I asked the Minister for lessons learned last time, she said that lessons learned would be considered at the time of sale. So I'm going to try the question again. Can the Minister explain what lessons have been learned about financial security and public liabilities from the Cantong and Mactung saga? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Minister responsible for ITI.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure that the lessons learned here are necessarily the ones that the member is expecting, insofar as, in this case, Mactung actually has turned out to be a fairly strategic and important critical minerals and metals project. It has been sold. It's been sold with the liabilities transferring to the owner, and hopefully will actually see the development of a critical minerals and metals project. So in that sense, it actually has all gone quite well, which isn't to say that the government generally wants to go out and be the buyer of a mine, but in this sense it did work out. As far as securities go, well, again, Mr. Speaker, this was a project that originally, under its previous ownership, that did go into CCAA, did not go through the board processes that we have today with respect to
ensuring regulatory compliance. The processes that we have now are, in my view, far more robust than what they were, and would hopefully not result in a situation where properties are undersecured. That is not anyone's expectation. And so again, in that sense, is that a lesson learned from this, or is that a lesson learned from devolution? Mr. Speaker, this again, I don't know that this is the time for that lesson. I think we've actually learned that lesson in other contexts. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My questions are for the Minister of Health and Social Services. I believe the department will work to create, a number of information items on each of the specified health conditions and work with those people to get the answers they're seeking moving forward. But I think as legislators, there's some fundamental questions about, whether this is a good idea in the first place, and I think one of those is cost. So my first question for the Minister of Health is, how much are we currently spending on providing extended health benefits to those with specified health conditions? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Health and Social Services is working to make the extended health benefits more equitable. And we've put out a number of products here, a discussion paper, an FAQ, and a plain language summary, which talks about the supplementary health benefits for low-income people and a drug program for catastrophic costs. The amount of money we're spending right now on the 54 specified disease conditions is $4.3 million, and that's for 1,514 individuals. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I guess the next question is, do we know, I'm actually somewhat unsure whether this is going to save us money or cost us more money, the switch from a specified list to a means-tested model. Do we know how much this current proposal will cost us or save us, Mr. Speaker?
Member for Yellowknife North, Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you. We're in the information gathering phase, and I'm gratified to say we've been getting a lot of feedback. So we don't have a specific model that we can apply costing to, but given the fact that we're going to include more benefits for more people, we expect the program to cost more. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yeah, I guess we're going to have to find out some data there, because I imagine providing prescription costs to people who already have specified diseases is more costly than, just because you are a low-income earner doesn't mean you get any prescriptions at all. We might bring thousands of people in who barely use the benefits. So I get there's some work to costing this. But to me, the department has kind of completely gone out and engaged on, to me, what are separate questions. One, do we want to provide a means-tested program? And two, do we want to get rid of the specified health? I don't know that we should be framing them as binary. And I guess my question to the minister is, why can't we keep both, Mr. Speaker?
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question. I don't see it as a binary situation here. The specified conditions list covers 54 diseases. If you have ALS, as one example, you're not on that list. You're not getting any help from the government of the N.W.T. So the starting point was to make the program more equitable for people who not only have drug costs for chronic conditions, but they also don't have any drug coverage at all. So that means for the most basic things like antibiotics. So the thing about this is that people in their conditions don't fit into these little silos very easily. So what we're trying to do here is ask the people who have the means to help pay for their own coverage, and to support the people who don't have the means to get the coverage they need to live their best lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Final supplementary. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My hope is that we could find a way to work with each of those people on the specified health condition list. I know there are some very expensive drugs and there are some people in some very unique circumstances, and we may have to keep some of the conditions. Also, I know we may have to revisit the list. There's some confusion to me why cancer is on there, if it's insured, what it actually is accomplishing by being on there. But my other question is, the federal government recently announced a federal dental care plan. It was means tested. And I believe there was an announcement in the work at the federal level to announce a federal pharmacare plan. I imagine it'll be means tested as well. I'm just wondering if the minister has any insight from her federal colleagues about any news in that area or how that would affect our current plans moving forward. It may make a lot of what we're trying to do moot, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Yellowknife North. Minister responsible for Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, first of all, the member has raised this issue about cancer drugs, and I want to give him a specific answer to this. If somebody has cancer and they're receiving treatment in a hospital, those drugs are provided to the person without any means testing or any charge. If after the cancer treatment there is a prescription that is preventative, like tamoxifen for breast cancer, then that is part of the specified condition list and it would be captured in this new program. So again, in response to his points, there is consideration for a drug benefit plan that would cover catastrophic medical costs. For example, the most current treatment for cystic fibrosis is $300,000 per year per client, which is obviously a very huge amount of money for anyone to undertake. So in terms of the federal government, we don't have any additional information about when pharmacare is going to happen. There was a report given to the federal government on the pharmacare program prior to the 2019 election, and we delayed the review of the supplementary health benefits program to wait for more information to come forward on pharmacare, national pharmacare. It hasn't come forward, so we've decided that we need to move forward with our own review. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Member for Mumfwee.
Due to housing crisis, what we need is action. Mr. Speaker, how can this assembly help the government of the Northwest Territories transfer housing properties to the Indigenous government faster? Thank you.
Thank you, Member for Mumfwee. Minister responsible for Housing N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member's question, thank you for that as well. That I just, the Clecho is a settled land claim area. They do have self-government. I would have to bring this forward to the respective government. If they are looking at housing units to be transferred, I would have to further those discussions with that appropriate government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions, Member. Oral questions. Oral questions. Written questions. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I have one more question for the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment. Would the Minister commit to share a copy of the draft agreement with Fireweed Zinc, the definitive agreement with the Standing Committee on a confidential basis before that's finalized? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For Frame Lake, Minister responsible for Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, subject to there being any legal reason that I can't do that, I would not have a problem doing that on a confidential basis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Oral questions. Oral questions. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's address. Replies to Commissioner's address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of committees on the review of bills. Reports of committees on the review of bills. Reports of standing and special committees. Reports of standing and special committees. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Member for Haver South.
I wish to table the following documents. 1. Analysis of regional flood risk planning and evacuation procedures following the May 2022 Hay River flood. 2. 2014 Northwest Territories Hazard Identification Risk Assessment, Government of Northwest Territories. Number 3, Assessment of Climate Change Impacts on Infrastructure in all N.W.T communities, Government of the Northwest Territories. 4, Highway Drainage Design Standards, Ontario Minister of Transport. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Haver South. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I wish to table the following document. It's a resolution number 2223-013, 52nd Denny National Assembly, subject Keepers of the Water Resolution. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, member for Frame Lake. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Motions. Motions. Notices of motion for the first reading of bills. Notices of motion for the first reading of bills. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Minister responsible for housing N.W.T.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to present to the House Bill 56, an act to amend the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation Act, to be read for the first time. Must see it, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Colleagues, pursuant to Rule 8.2(3), Bill 56, an act to amend the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation Act, is deemed read the first time and is now ready for second reading. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Minister responsible for justice.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to present to the House Bill 57, Miscellaneous Statute Law Amendment Act 2022, to be read for the first time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Colleagues, pursuant to Rule 8.2(3), Bill 57, Miscellaneous Statute Amendment Act 2022 is deemed read for the first time and is now ready for second reading. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration and committee of the whole of bills and other matters. Bill 23, 29, 48, 52, and 53. Table document 723-19(2) with member for Nivik Twin Lakes signature.
I now call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee? Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Committee wishes to consider table document 723-19(2), 2023-2024 capital estimates with general comments, Legislative Assembly, Justice, and Municipal and Community Affairs. Merci.
Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. We'll take a short recess and resume with the first item. I now call Committee of the Whole back to order. Committee, we've agreed to consider table document 723-19 brackets 2, capital estimates 2023-2024. Does the Minister of Finance have any opening remarks?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I am happy to present N.W.T's 2023-24 capital estimates. These capital estimates total $328 million to support and continue infrastructure investment in our communities. Major highlights of the plan include $95.1 million for highways, winter roads, bridges, and culverts. This funding includes $13.4 million for the Frank Channel Bridge, $12 million for the Prohibition Creek Access Road, $19.8 million for the advancement of environmental and planning work on the Mackenzie Valley and Slave Geologic Province all-season roads. $45 million for various airport and runway projects under the Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund, investing in Canada Infrastructure Plan and the National Department of Defence. And $42.9 million for renewable energy projects, including $18 million for the Fort Providence transmission lines and $6.7 million for planning the expansion of the Charleston hydroelectric system. $32.6 million for planning and construction of long-term care facilities, health centers, improvements to health information systems services, biomedical equipment, including $11.6 million for the health center in Toledo and $10 million for the Wellness and Recovery Center in Yellowknife. $8 million for planning and construction of schools, including $2 million to complete the work at the Mangalaluk School in Tuktoyaktuk, and $3.5 million to renovate and expand the Aurora College Western Arctic Research Center warehouse, and $29 million in continued funding to support community governments with their infrastructure needs. The overall capital spend is offset by a total of $183.3 million in support from the federal government through various infrastructure programs, including $101 million from the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Plan, $23.3 million from the National Trade Corridors Fund, $20 million from the Department of National Defence, $17.8 million from the Building Canada Plan, $10.7 million from the Disaster Mitigation and Adaptation Fund, and $10.2 million from other partnerships. That concludes my opening remarks, Madam Chair. We are happy to answer any questions members may have.
Thank you, Minister. We've agreed to begin with the general comments on the capital estimates. Do members wish to make general comments before we consider the table document in detail? Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess in general, I support the new approach taken in these capital estimates to reduce the amount to what we are actually going to spend. I note this has freed up quite a bit of room in our debt ceiling because we are not committed to borrowing the money for projects that, seem to be completely behind schedule for a variety of reasons. But I just want to talk about the lack of information that I think is currently around all of our infrastructure, and I believe it is information that would be best provided when we deal with the capital budget. For example, we don't know what our current infrastructure deficit is in the Northwest Territories, other than that it is far more money that we can afford. We don't publicly know what our 5-year capital plan is and what projects we're building in the next 5 years. I suspect that document exists, but it is not a public document. We don't know how much specific projects are going to cost. You will hear me ask this a number of times as we review this. What is this road going to cost? What is this school going to cost? Also not public information, and we are expected to approve that money over the coming days without actually being told that figure publicly. The capital estimates don't provide an update on our deferred maintenance backlog, other than we know it is also hundreds of millions of dollars that our assets are in need of desperate repair, and we consistently underfund repairing our assets. I really believe we have, as the N.W.T, have not done proper asset management. We have no idea of what state all our assets are in and what need of repair they are in, other than we know it's hundreds of millions of dollars. Getting into the weeds a little bit, I think it would be prudent to report how many of our assets have reached zero book value. And what I mean by that is every time we build something, we amortize it over the expected life cycle. And I'm quite confident that the vast majority of our assets have reached zero book value, which would imply we're supposed to replace them. But that's probably hundreds of millions of dollars that we also do not have to replace our infrastructure. All around, we table this capital document and we get excited that we're going to spend a couple $100 million building new things, but we don't really talk about the fact that we have billions of dollars of infrastructure across, the government, and most importantly, probably the Power Corp has another couple $1 billion in need of replacement. If we look at the state of all our hydro, many of it, long overdue for replacement. And none of that information comes with the capital budget. So we are asked to add more infrastructure to an ever-growing infrastructure deficit and an ever-growing maintenance backlog. Some work is being done on this, but ultimately I think you can look at a number of jurisdictions that publish much more detailed analysis of all their assets, all their infrastructure, much more detailed analysis of what they're building over the next 5, 10, 20 years with costing. That is all public. That is not something we do. And I will have a number of questions on that to make that information public as we go through these capital estimates. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, member for Yellowknife North. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. I do have some comments to make on the capital estimates, but I have one question for the Minister, and to start with. And earlier in this setting, there was some information tabled in the House about a special warrant, and that also included some information about what N.W.T expects to be perhaps most of what's required for flood relief. And the total was, I think, $174 million. So I know that this was unanticipated. We may be able to recover some of those costs, probably not all of them. I'd like to know from the Minister what impact the Hay River flood relief, and then the bigger issue of mitigation in the future, what impact that actually has on the operating surplus and the spending that's anticipated in the capital estimates. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, member. Minister of Finance. Witnesses are in, or are you okay with answering this, or?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, let me try and answer it, and I'm sure the member will let me know if we need to bring the witnesses in. There are finance witnesses in the witness room. Madam Chair, it's 174. I don't have that number in front of me, but it does sound approximately correct from my recollection. But I think the question is really getting at what that does to our fiscal situation. And having an over 100, unexpectedly over $100 million in costs associated with the floods takes out the surplus that we had been projecting for 22-23. And puts us into a situation where we are likely to be where we are expecting now to be in a deficit situation. So that does mean that we wouldn't be in compliance ultimately if that's the case with the fiscal responsibility policy. However, you'll recall that there is a period of 2 years of lag time to catch back up. So we may not. It may actually not necessarily. It means we don't have the surplus, but we may not be in non-compliance. As for the longer-term projection, we are still expecting, because we do get a significant amount of that refunded by the federal government under the disaster assistance policy, that does catch us back up. And so by 23-24, we'd be back to anticipating a surplus in the amount of $131 million. Again, given that we'd be, I'm expecting that we won't get the money for disaster assistance this fiscal, or certainly not the bulk of it. And then we wind up catching back up. There's also a significant amount of catch-up happening under the territorial formula finance policy because of all the costs that provinces were paying out during COVID. That reflects in terms of what we then get under the TIF. So this year definitely is being impacted, but we do catch up. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Member for Frame Lake.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Can the Minister commit to provide some publicly available information around these new projections that she has been talking about with regard to our finances and our fiscal situation resulting from the Hay River flooding? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, member. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I'm happy to do that. We did do budget dialogues again this spring, at which point we had an update at the spring period. But certainly a lot of the work to assist communities that were affected by the flood was taking place over the spring and summer. So those final numbers were coming in, and I am happy to get that information out again.
Thank you. Member for Frame Lake.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Does the minister have a time frame in mind for getting that information to us as regular MLAs, but also to the public? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, so, there were updates that provided back in, I believe, August when we were preparing for this session. As I said, numbers related to the information that was received through the spring and summer as flood remediation work was ongoing certainly were being updated through the course of time. All of the information does go into the main estimates documents. I can see if we can put some sort of package together, more urgently than that, without having anyone from the department here in front of me. And even if they were here, I don't know that I can say if it's tomorrow or the next day. But I realize that members may want to have that information this session, so we'll get something together.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Frame Lake.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Yeah, I appreciate the commitment from the minister. And as much as I'd like to see it, I think the public also needs to see this. So I'll take her commitment there. I do want to make some remarks now. I do want to compliment the minister for the new approach, limiting capital spending to the $260 million cap. That I think better reflects our ability to actually get money out the door. And I know that the department is also doing much better tracking of the reasons for carryovers and can then, work towards trying to look at what the barriers are and how to change that. And I know that they've also got a procurement review underway, which might allow us to do some of this work more quickly and retain more of the benefits. But Madam Chair, I'm going to take some of the credit, and I think the regular MLAs are going to take some of the credit for this new capital approach, which the minister made her statement yesterday in the House about this when she tabled them. We have been on the minister as regular MLAs for the entire assembly about the over-budgeting, the overspending on capital. Overspending on that I've raised, certainly over budgeting and the amount of carryovers. So, I have not voted in favor of a single capital budget in this assembly, and I have raised these issues again and again and again. So I want to thank the minister for listening and actually decreasing the envelope or putting a cap on capital spending. So that's the good news. The bad news is I still think you're spending on the wrong priorities. And all I have to do is turn to page 2 here, and the largest single key investment area in the entire budget, the highest amount, 30% on highways and roads. Why are we not spending 30% of our budget on housing? That should be the highest priority for this assembly, not highways and roads in terms of capital investment. And it's no secret that I have never accepted a number of the large infrastructure projects as priorities. The Slade Geological Province Road, I shouldn't have used that word, is not a priority, especially at a time when the Bathurst Caribou herd is in decline and a regional study is being discussed. We should not be spending money on something like that. I also disagree with Tolson expansion. I don't think there's no buyer that's been identified. Without a buyer, there's no project. And I think we can make a much better use of the funds that would be invested in that project to build community and individual homeowner energy self-sufficiency. So I disagree fundamentally with Cabinet's spending priorities, and as shown here, highways and roads, highest item. So I will likely still vote against this budget, but I want to thank the minister for her efforts to decrease the over-budgeting on capital. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, member. Are there any further questions, comments Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess this cautious approach, I guess, in spending in capital spending is interesting. But I guess what is of concern, I guess, to me is that, departments appear, I guess, we know that they're unable to spend the funding received from federal government to actually complete projects. And, we're seeing important projects being pushed back. We're seeing with possible, maybe lapse of funding, I'm not sure. But does the minister, does this raise a concern, I guess, to the minister? Because, we look at less spending on capital, but have we looked at anything else to maybe encourage, say, securing contractors to come north, finding ways to entice workers to come north, so that we can actually take these projects on and finish them with the money we have before we start losing it. Thank you.
Thank you. Member. Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, this isn't just, to be clear, a function of the circumstances of the labour market shortages that all of Canada and the world are experiencing today. This is reflective of, the last 10 years that we saw that, the average spend in the last 10 years, year over year, is around $250 million per year. So it's not new that we simply don't have the capacity in the north alone to be getting out to have much more than that spent in any particular given year. So it's not entirely a function of current labour market shortages. It is a function in part of general labour shortages in the north. And to that, I would say that over the course of that time, certainly before my time here or any, at the time of the 19th Assembly, there have been efforts at increasing the population to various forms of recruitment, and they've also obviously not been successful. I don't know that alone is going to entirely solve the problem. I think there should be a broader look at increasing the population, increasing the economy, having a positive and pleasant and wonderful place to come and live and work, as we all know it to be. Does that change the fact that for the last 10 years or more, the capital budget has been oversized relative to what we could perform? No, it doesn't. So fixing this problem doesn't mean we don't want to look at increasing the population, but I just want to kind of separate out that isn't necessarily going to take away the reasons that we've done what we've done now, which is to right-size the capital plan, reduce the need to borrow, and to put money into planning. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess my concern is that, this government goes to the federal government and seeks funding for initiatives that we want to undertake. And now we have to go back to the federal government and tell them that we can't complete the work that we promised we're going to complete in a timely manner. So I guess I would ask the minister, does she see that as an impediment now to securing federal funding for the new initiatives? Because if we're not spending not spending the money on what we're supposed to and finish those projects, is the government, or does she think that the government is going to be a little more reluctant to fund our projects? And has she had actually any discussions with her counterparts? Thank you.
Thank you, Member. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, it actually, one of the sources of concern that's been raised has actually been colleagues in the federal government who've said, why aren't you spending more? What are you spending? And they want to have accountability for the dollars that they are committing to the Northwest Territories. So if there are projects that are delayed or stalled, again, for a variety of reasons, but for whatever reason it may be that attaches to any particular project, they would rather know that when we have a properly sized budget that we can then be held accountable to deliver upon, and be more focused on the reasons that a project might get held up. So it's not to say that some of these projects won't still face some sort of delay, but we're not looking at a monster-sized envelope that is more likely to see that. Federal departments have been consulted. Certainly, a lot of officials level conversations have been had. And I know myself and Minister Archie have had conversations when the Federal Minister of Infrastructure was here, and the messaging actually was, figure out what you can do, and to focus on that. So I actually think this will be a positive signal to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, I've got a real concern because I look at, some of the projects that are getting pushed back, and just as an example, the extended care facility in Hay River back to 27, 28, and then I see that, well, they're going to reevaluate. Well, I'm not exactly sure what that means. We talk about, we've had flooding, and we talk about dredging, and, we're going to be looking for money for that. Are we going to get turned down because of our inability to, to complete what we're supposed to complete? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member. I'll take that as a comment. Did you have any further questions for the Minister or any other comments?
That was just a comment.
Thank you. Are there any further questions, comments? No. Member for Trinidad-Willowday.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. A couple of questions. The reduction that you have here, we got a total capital budget of $328 million. In regards to my riding, this fiscal year with $3.4 million for public housing repairs, with no home ownership repairs in the communities. I'm just wondering, like my colleague Mr. O'Reilly talked about the percentage in terms of highways and versus housing, etc. My question to the minister is this budget here carved in stone, or can that be adjusted? Thank you.
Thank you, Member. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Madam Chair, this is the proposed capital budget. So it's before the House now for discussion, that's exactly the point here. It's not approved before it's approved by this House. That's precisely the discussions we are to be having over the next short while. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member for Trinidad-Willowday.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Also, during the budgeting process back in March of this year, there were some discussions that was happening in regards to monies made to a committee about $5 million towards housing. I'm not really sure exactly. I've never seen no breakdown of this $5 million as to where the money's going and who's getting this $5 million. Can the minister maybe just elaborate a little bit on that? Thank you.
Thank you, Member. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that the MLA is referencing discussions that were had between myself and colleagues on the other side when we were preparing the main estimates and passing the main estimates. And I certainly can provide, I believe this information has been provided, but I'm happy to go through it again. There were increases at the conclusions of those discussions made to various program budgets within Housing N.W.T. It was, I believe, $6.6 million that was committed in addition as part of the main estimates discussions to fund projects that are specifically directed where money that goes out to constituents, goes out to residents. So, for example, I'm drawing a blank, but things where people can do their own constructions, they can do their own renovations, they can do their own upgrades, and that money has moved out $4 million and then ongoing. So anyways, I certainly can provide confirmation of what's gone out one by one if that would be of assistance. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Trinidad-Willowday.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This year I went through the budget and went through the committees, and we discussed it in the House here. At the end of the day, I voted against the budget, and mainly because of there was really nothing there. We got rounded off to 2% of the overall budget that we got in our writing. and that's still concerning. My question again to the minister is that if this is not carved in stone and we could have further discussion on this, whether it be highways being 30% and housing 11%, is there a way we could increase that so that we are really addressing the need of housing, but yet still meeting the mandate of this government that was put forward in 2019? And that mandate overall. But having said that, though, if that's if we could look at that, but at the same time, it'd be nice if we could start working with Indigenous governments, because right now, as it is, we're going to have to figure a way to do things better. And maybe through a contribution agreement, because right now we're still dealing with all the bureaucratic red tape in the government, and I just thought maybe we could maybe look at this. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member. Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Madam Chair, I mean, as I said, certainly that's the point of bringing the matter here, is for us all as an Assembly to have an opportunity to discuss how to spend the public dollars we are responsible for as a collective. And certainly, some budgets could be adjusted, and maybe there's, I know there's going to be probably requests to increase some areas. I would just sort of keep in mind, or urge people to keep in mind, that if we are increasing the overall plan, then we are again adding dollars into a plan that we know we will not spend all of that. We already, over the last 10 years, have never spent anywhere near 300 million, and this one already is over 300 million. We will no doubt have some carryovers from that. So if there's requests to increase, then two things to be kept in mind. One, not all of it can be delivered upon, but two, it does mean we're then having to take on the debt to deliver it, particularly, that we would have to take on the debt to deliver upon it and increase the borrowing plan, which puts us closer to the borrowing limit. So again, everything's to be discussed, but just to keep in mind what the consequences of those discussions are. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Trinidad-Willowday.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When I was elected back on February 10th of this year, 2 years earlier, the N.W.T went through, elected all the MLAs for this Assembly, for the 19th Assembly, and they had a meeting where they brought all their wants and needs and for their constituency in the N.W.T. When I came in, I never had that opportunity, and I looked at some of the capital plans. So for Dilo, Deta, Thutsuke, Ford Resolution, we do have our own wants and needs as well, but I just want to, we brought this issue to the minister a few weeks ago with Chief Marlowe, and he raised the issue in Thutsuke in regards to the dust problem in that community. If there's a way we can look at that, either start developing some kind of chip seal program for that community so we could address the dust problem. And that dust problem has been there for a long time and hasn't been really addressed. And then that's the same thing in Ford Resolution, in the community Ford Resolution. We should really take a look at doing a chip seal program in that community, and that's a concern. But overall, Madam Chair, if we could take a look at this, then maybe I'll be in favor of voting in favor of this budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Member. Are there any further comments, general comments to the capital plan? Member for Nunavut.
Thank you, Madam Chair. No, just in regards to, like my colleague, Mr. Johnson, I am liking the new format of the spending on our, and I see so much that says Nunavut on it, so I'll be supporting this for sure. And it's good to see, but just a couple of questions I do have with the contracts that we do have out. The numbers I got, I'll start off with the Mangalaluk School. We have a contract that's out. We asked for reports, I guess, on who's hired, like for community, because I know there's not too many community hires in the community of Tuk, and it's all seems to be outsiders. So, and we asked for a plan, a scope, business scope for the project, and we haven't received it yet from the contractor, and it's been going on 2 years now. I just want to make sure that our government is making sure that they're staying on top of it in regards to to getting that plan so my leadership could see it, because my leadership's asking me the same thing. So I think if anything, I know that the department did go into the community, but I know that they were busy taking a look at the site, so they were too busy to meet with my leadership. So I think on the next go around, I think if they're able to come into the community to meet with my leadership through the Mayor of Tuck and the Hamlet, the community corporation, I think that would be a good thing, just to try to work together, because it's too big of a project in the middle of the community. It's a good project that's well needed, and but I think that has to be done. Number two, the upgrades on the Tuck-Inuvik Highway. The upgrades that we have, how much you know, there's a couple of sections on there where it's flat with the permafrost. It's getting more dangerous. Frost heaves are coming up when it gets colder now. It just pops up out of nowhere. So we're looking at the cost, how much it's going to cost our government, and to make sure that they're, you know, talking with the contractors on that road to make sure that they're doing the sections that mostly needed for safety, public safety, and to keep that road upgraded for years to come. And our liquefied natural gas, I see it in here for M18. From my understanding, that M18 is being put into litigation in regards to permission to go on Tuck 71A lands, which were our land claim is signed, and you're on Tuck 71A lands as being the people of Tuck own that land, and the access to it, access to that gas. I want to know where we're going with this in regards to, with my minister, in regards to seeing what's going to happen, because if we're a land claim group, we already were signed since 1984. This is a good news story, because one, we're going to service Inuvik with natural gas. We're not getting it all the way from BC. Safety aspects on the Dempster Highway. And it creates jobs for the community. But we have to find a way to get and push that issue in regards to making sure that M18 is a go and not being stalled like they did with the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline. That's really, for myself, that's like a slap in the face as an invaluable beneficiary, that you're on our land, and we're going to give you our gas. We're resource rich and cash poor. And our people, we have to work together as a government, as with the Inuvialuit, as a community corporation, to get this project off and running in the right direction. So that's all I have to say, but thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, member, and just a reminder to all of the great comments. I hope you say them again when we have the minister and their witnesses in front of us to bring those issues out and possibly get some more detailed answers. I will go now to member for Decho. Oh no, sorry, member for Tabacha and then Decho.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just believe that a balanced approach to budgeting is important. You can't have it all one way, though. It has to be kind of balanced, because your outputs when you're in doing business with people within the territory and you're working for the members of the N.W.T, there's so much lack of infrastructure in the tiny communities and regional centers that those cannot be ignored. And if there's not enough staff that are qualified to make sure those deadlines and those projects are completed, then what is happening? You know, we have all the staff per capita with bureaucratic staff in the territories per capita to other individuals in the territories. It's phenomenal. So actually, you know, you wonder how is the thinking going? You think about it, and in a business world, that would never happen. One of the things that I'm very concerned about is the homelessness in Fort Smith, and it must be addressed. You know, we came up with an innovative idea of tiny homes for a pilot project, so the person actually would have a small home that are homeless, and they take care of it and they look after it themselves, and those kind of ideas got to be taken seriously. If you're just going to put them in another place where it's another burden to someone else. That's not going to build their esteem. That's not going to build them up to be a better person. It's not going to. It's a really not a win-win situation, and I want the cabinet and the Minister of Finance to rethink some of these issues. And I think and we talk about housing across the territories. I was able to visit a couple of communities this summer. We went to a few, and even in Lutsukay. You look around the community, and you find the people very happy, but and with what they have, and compared to everywhere else, it's not enough. It's you wonder how anyone could actually survive in a community where you don't have choices. And, so we have to think a little bit differently because we serve a different population in the north, where cost is phenomenal. There's not a lot of infrastructure, and people look forward to projects in their communities and in the regional centers, and I'm trying not to take away from Yellowknife. We're not trying to take away anything from here. Nothing shuts down here, but many times there are things that do shut down in our areas for lack of persistence from people who do not do their jobs in some offices. So I just want to make sure that I like the balanced approach, but we also got to be very aware that in the business world, this would not take place. That you have the money, you spend the money, and you make money. And if we don't start thinking in that way, and I don't agree with some of my colleagues' aspects with regards to the Tolson Hydro expansion. Yellowknife needs that Tolson Hydro expansion. That's probably why it's going ahead. Fort Smith's fine. But, I'm very happy, and I supported it 100%, 150%, 200%, because that's the way things are going in this world. And for greener energy, it's the perfect energy. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member for Tabacha. General comments, Member for Decho.
Merci, Madam Chair. Madam Minister, it was noted here that highways and roads take up 30%, the largest chunk of the budget. I'm not sure what work this all entails, but every year we're fixing up pretty much maybe same sections every year or every 2 years. I'm wondering, the reason I'm looking at this, and if someone could live with a bit of potholes for several years, because the hamlet of Enterprise is the only community in the whole of the Northwest Territories without a school. They've been requesting for a school, I think for over 15 years, 20 years. And recently, over the last couple of years, year or so, all the documentation was lost. Enterprises, is the first community coming into the Northwest Territories. And there's not much attention being given to the community, the hamlet of Enterprise, in terms of infrastructure. And the school is much needed in a community of this size to draw people to the community, and then you can build capacity within. All they're asking for is an elementary school. They have very many concerns about the extreme weather conditions that are happening lately, probably due to climate change, and they have a lot of young children. But mothers have to wake up early, to prepare them for the bus. So there's a safety concern in all this. The hamlet of enterprise, we need to help them to grow. And that begins with the school. You know, we're not asking for much here. We're asking for consideration to get the groundwork going and maybe pre-planning at this stage, which is not a lot. Like I said, somebody could live with a little bit of potholes for a year or two longer. And we can make this a reality for the hamlet of enterprise. And together as a government, we can watch as the community grows. So I really hope that you would make consideration for that as the Minister of Finance. Masi.
Thank you. Member, are there any further general comments? So we'll move on to the detail. Seeing no, we'll proceed to the detailed table document beginning with the Legislative Assembly. Speaker, does the Speaker wish to bring witnesses into the chamber?
Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sergeant-at-Arms, please escort the witnesses into the chamber. Welcome. Mr. Speaker, would you please introduce your witnesses?
Thank you, Madam Chair. With me today we have our Sergeant-at-Arms, Brian Thagard, also Kim Wickens, our Deputy Clerk, Members Precinct Services.
Thank you. Committee has agreed to forego general comments on this section. Is the committee agreed to proceed to the detailed in the table document? Okay, thank you. Committee, the Legislative Assembly begins on page 14 and will defer the Legislative Assembly totals and review the estimates by activity summary beginning at page 15 with the Office of the Clerk with information items on page 16. And I'm just going to remind members that you have 10 minutes to speak to the item if you wish to speak, and to use your 10 minutes if you're going to, because I will not go back to the member. So thank you. Any questions on the Legislative Assembly? Member for Frame Lake.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks to our valued guests. So the information we've got here in the capital estimates are that this allocation of $200,000 is for building accessibility upgrades. Can we just get some details of what's expected here? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member for Frame Lake. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good question there, Member for Frame Lake. The proposed upgrade is to ensure that accessibility for employees and members of the public is a priority in creating barrier-free washrooms. Thank you.
Thank you. Member for Frame Lake.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks to the Speaker for that information. So when we say barrier-free washrooms, is that just on this main floor, or is it throughout the building? And is it like widening of doors, stalls? Generally, what kind of work is going to be done? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member. Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Some of the improvements that'll be conducted are actually on both floors. Which includes design features that convert the two existing non-accessible washrooms at the end of the executive hallway into full accessible facilities, and to ensure sufficient space for the upgrades 2 additional rooms in the immediate area, janitor's closet and committee room A storage room, will be configured into new washroom spaces. Thank you.
Thank you. Member for Frame Lake?
No, thanks. I want to thank the Speaker and our staff for doing the work to plan for this. I support this expenditure of money to make the building more accessible, and I think the Speaker's going to get off a little easy today, but appreciate the work. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Member, are there any further questions, comments under Legislative Assembly? Seeing no further questions, I'll call it. Legislative Assembly, Office of the Clerk, Infrastructure Investments, $200,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, members. Please return now to the legislative summary found at page 14, Legislative Assembly 2023-2024 capital estimates, $200,000. Member for Frame Lake.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Nothing about our guests at the table here, but I move that this committee defer further consideration of the estimates for the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly at this time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The motion is on the floor and being distributed. It's being distributed. Okay. So- The motion is in order. To the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Abstentions? Motion is carried. Thank you. Committee, does that committee agree that we shall proceed now to the Department of Justice? Thank you, committee, and thank you to Mr. Speaker and his witnesses. Sergeant at Arms, please escort the witnesses from the... Oh, yes, Mr. Speaker?
Yeah, sorry, Madam Chair, just closing comments here. I'd like to thank the members for their ongoing support. But seriously, I'd just like to thank our witnesses, Ms. Wickens and also Mr. Brian Thygert, our Sergeant at Arms. This will be his last budget he'll be presenting after 30 some odd years, so please, big hand of applause. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sergeant at Arms, please escort the witnesses from the chamber. Okay. Committee will now consider the Department of Justice. Does the Minister of Justice wish to bring witnesses into the chamber?
Yes, please.
Sergeant at Arms, please escort the witnesses into the chamber. Welcome. Minister, would you please introduce your witnesses?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have Charlene Doolittle, the Deputy Minister of the Department of Justice, and James Bancroft, the Director of Corporate Services.
The committee has agreed to forego general comments as the committee agreed to proceed to the detail contained in the table document. Committee, the Department of Justice begins on page 60. We will defer the departmental totals and review the estimates by activity summary beginning at page 61 with corrections, with information items on page 62. Questions, comments? Member for Yellowknife North. Sorry, I was going to choke.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just looking at the line item for specialized courts and integrated case management services tenant improvements in Yellowknife. We're making some office improvements for integrated service delivery model. Can I just get a bit more explanation of what that is and what building that's in? Thank you.
Thank you. Member, Minister?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, I'll just hand it to Mr. Bancroft. He has the details on this one.
Thank you, Minister. Mr. Bancroft?
Thank you, Madam Chair. To answer the member's question about the location of the building currently, it's in the what's been known as the old highways building in Yellowknife, on the main street. And the details about the tenant improvements is to make the space more usable for the program that's operating in there, that being integrated case management and the specialized courts.
Thank you. Member for Yellowknife North?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Do we have a total cost for that project? Just concerned about how much money we're putting into what I assume is Northview building. Thank you.
Thank you, Member. Minister?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, as I understand it, the costs aren't laid out in the capital estimates. Thank you.
Thank you. Member for Yellowknife North?
Can someone tell me who owns that building, Madam Chair?
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you. I'm not sure who the owner of that building is. Thank you. But we can find out and get that information to the member. Thank you.
Thank you. Member for Yellowknife North?
Thank you for that commitment. Can the Minister confirm that he'll publicly provide that information? Thank you.
Sorry, can you repeat your question?
I got a commitment there to find out some undisclosed amount of money into someone's building that we don't own, but I'm wondering if we can get the commitment that we will publicly tell us who owns this building for the undisclosed amount of money. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member. Minister?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have no problem disclosing who the building owner is. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any further questions, comments under this section? All right, so please return now to the departmental summary found on I just about missed the budget line. All right, so Justice Corrections Infrastructure Investment, $1,480,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, members. Please return now to the departmental summary found on page 60. Justice 2022-2023, capital estimates $1,480,000. Member, Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Madam Chair. Did we skip court services and services to the public, or?
Expenditure, $0.
Okay, 23, 24, got it. Okay, sorry, Madam Chair, I move that this committee defer further consideration of the estimates for the Department of Justice at this time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The motion is on the floor and being distributed. The motion is in order. To the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Abstentions? Thank you. The motion is carried. Thank you, committee, and thank you to the minister. Sergeant at Arms, please escort the minister from the chamber. Or the minister, the witnesses. Remove the minister. Take them all out. I don't have that authority, no. Does the committee agree to proceed to the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs? Committee, we will now consider the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs. Does the Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs wish to bring witnesses into the chamber? Thank you. Sergeant at Arms, please escort the witnesses into the chamber. Minister, would you please introduce your witness?
On my left is Deputy Minister Guru.
Welcome. The committee has agreed to forego general comments. Is the committee agreed to proceed to the detailed table in the table document? Committee, the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs begins on page 68. We will defer the departmental totals and review the estimates by activity beginning at page 69 with the regional operations with information items on page 70. Municipal and Community Affairs Regional Operations Infrastructure Investments, $29,160,000. Any questions, comments? Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I see there's $29 million here, and it's going to 33 communities. We list all the communities on page 70, but we don't say how much they're getting. Is the minister willing to provide a public breakdown about how much each of these communities is getting? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Yellowknife North.
That makes me very happy. Wow, I don't even know. I had a whole line of other questions. Been asking for that for years. Okay, well,
He's done.
No questions. Sorry, I guess my next question is, this is money provided for capital under the funding formula. I see it's $29 million here. If we were following, if we had the money to commit to what's in the formula, how much money would actually be here? AK, what's the deficit shortage? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member. Minister?
So my understanding, the gap's about 20 million.
Thank you. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I know that we provide this money and then we're working with a number of communities to provide asset management plans, and they're all kind of in a different stage of doing that, where hopefully I think a few will have complete planning done. I'm just wondering if that's a requirement of the funding or whether we are requiring all communities to have asset management plans done. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member. Minister?
Details to turn to the Deputy Minister.
Thank you. Deputy Minister Guru.
Thank you. As a condition of the community public infrastructure funding that you see in today's capital estimates, MACA does require that all community governments develop a 5-year capital plan, and we work with them on that development. As part of that, we also do require asset management plans, recognizing that community governments are in various stages of completion of those plans. Thank you.
Thank you. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, I'm glad to hear that, and I think asset management planning is important. I think it's a little ridiculous that we require our community governments to do it, and we do not have an asset management plan. If you looked at N.W.T, we'd be in about step -100 of asset management planning. Step 1 being figuring out how much you actually own. But I'm glad we're letting our requiring our communities do that. Maybe one day we will do it. I guess I want to go to another issue I have with the way we do our budgeting and see if Maka will comment. I can go to, well, I'm looking at the town of Inuvik's 5-year capital plan, and it tells me what they're going to spend every 5 years. You know, I can see that they're spending $70,000 in 2023 on a motor control panel replacement. The N.W.T doesn't provide this information because it says it affects procurement. Have we told the town of Inuvik or any other municipalities that they probably shouldn't publish this information because it's going to affect their tenders? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, member. Minister?
Thank you. So again, the members got the town of Inuvik's plan. That's their plan, and that's how they're doing it and how they're providing that information. The information that we're going to give to the members, it's for them. Like it's not for public consumption. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Yellowknife North.
Sorry, perhaps I need to get a clarification there. Is the minister willing to publicly provide how much each community is getting under the funding we are seeing here? Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
Okay, so the amount we're giving the communities, yes. The community plans, no. Those plans belong to the communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I'll sneak one more in here, which is this is the capital funding we give communities. I know we also give them operations funding and water and sewer. Does this mean that we are now going to provide a breakdown by community for each of the 3 funding groups publicly? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member. Minister Maka.
I want to say no, but yes, we will.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Frame Lake.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Well, while the minister's on a roll here, so on page 69, large capital projects, it was 31.5 million in 21-22, and it's gone down now to 29 million. And of course, the cost of living's actually gone up. So can someone explain to me the decline in funding here to our communities? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member. Minister Maka.
For that type of detail, I'll turn to the Deputy Minister. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So what you're seeing, that 31.5 million in 21-22, that was provided via supplementary funding. So in that fiscal year, community governments received their 29 million base funding and then an additional 2.4 million in supplementary funding, which was part of the reducing the municipal funding gap. That additional 2.4 million continues to be provided to community governments, but it's actually included in MACA's main estimates. We have a budget line in our main estimates called Community Government Mandate Funding, and it's part of that funding. That number in our main estimates is made of the additional funding provided to community governments for capital, which is around the 2.4 million, plus O&M money, plus water and sewer money. So it's just a breakdown of where that money is reflected. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Minister. Member for Frame Lake.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks for that explanation. Yeah, I get that. The last time I looked, I think the consumer price index for Yellowknife was about 7.8% or something. And I don't know what it is across the N.W.T, but I just don't see any allowance here for any kind of an increase for community governments in terms of inflation. No forced growth. How does the department ensure then that the communities are able to use or provide the programs and services and do the infrastructure replacement if the money that they get from MACA is not increasing? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member. Minister Maka.
So we do have staff that works with the municipalities. We help them with the plans, see where their challenges are, and see how we can help them move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Member for Frame Lake.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Okay, so where are we at with calculating a new version or figure for the municipal funding gap and actually addressing that? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Minister of Maca.
So toward that detail, just turn to the Deputy Minister. Thank you.
Thank you. Deputy Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So MAC is currently working with the N.W.T Association of Communities and the local government administrators of the N.W.T on updating the 4 main community government funding policies. As part of that process, MACA has committed to provide each community government with a breakdown for their individual department of the quantum of the municipal funding gap and where that gap is, if it's O&M, if it's water, sewer, if it's capital. The reason we've committed to that is, as Minister Thompson was saying earlier, because it's a good planning tool and it's helpful for community governments to have that information so that they can plan and budget accordingly, and then MAC is able to support them in that process. Thank you.
Thank you. Member for Frame Lake.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. Yeah, I agree that that'd be really helpful for the communities to individually have, and it would also be helpful for MLAs to have in terms of making sure that we get as much money as we can into MACA to get it out to the communities again. So is that sort of information going to be available publicly? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Minister of Maca.
So we can share it with committee, but again, right now it's with the communities. It'll be with the communities, and how they share it is up to them. But we're willing to work with committee to get that information. And if N.W.T says, yeah, we want to make it public, then we're good with it. But again, we need to work with our municipalities with this. Thank you.
Thank you. Member for Frame Lake.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate the commitment there from the Minister to share it with us and then work with N.W.T, and I don't see any reason why this couldn't or shouldn't be made public, but I could sort of thinking of some kind of a public dashboard that, could get updated at least once a year, but okay. Lastly, I know my colleague asked about the asset plans. How many asset plans have actually been finished for community governments? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister of Maca.
So we don't have that detail. We'll have to get back to committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Member for Frame Lake.
Yeah, thanks for that. I guess I'm trying to find a way to talk about this because I know what the number is, but let's just say it's significantly less than the number of communities that are outlined on page 70 from what I understand. So if, a significant number of communities don't have completed asset plans, and that's my understanding, how do we actually know what the municipal funding gap is, and how do we, how do we get that every community to have a community asset plan? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister of Maca.
Yeah, so yes, we're working with the communities to get their asset plan in place. But again, we're working with them, and we had COVID. I can tell you that right now. When I was working, dealing with one of my constituents, communities, and they talked about their asset plan, the problem was that we couldn't get staff in there to do the work. So our staff are starting to work with the municipalities to address this very concern, and we're willing to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Member for Frame Lake.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. Okay, I'll just make a suggestion to the Minister that if he needs some extra money to kind of get this work done quickly so that all the asset plans are done, within a reasonable period of time, I'd be happy to support that as a supplemental appropriation, because we need that information to calculate and track what the municipal funding gap is. If communities and MACA don't know what their assets are, how do you know what the gap is? So is that something the department is prepared to look at, is what it would take to get this work done a little more quickly than the pace that it seems to have happened at? Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Minister of MACA.
Thank you. So it is one of our priorities to get done, and we're working with N.W.T on that. But for clarity on how the process is done, I'll turn to the Deputy Minister with your permission, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Deputy Minister.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As Minister Thompson said, we are working with the N.W.T on asset management planning. It's a concern of community governments as well as the N.W.T board. In terms of, you know, how the lack of asset management plans relates to the mandate funding gap, we do have a considerable amount of asset management data. We used it for our 2014 municipal gap review. We get, so the community governments belong to a common insurance company called Norsix. They share their insurance data with us. You know, it's a big piece of their work to make sure all of their assets are insured. We have that data. We have a lot of data from, you know, pre-New Deal on the nature and level of assets. For those communities where we don't have a complete listing, you know, we do have regional staff who are aware of communities and are aware of what assets are in place in each community. So that is how we've worked with the N.W.T to quantify the asset management gap using data from community governments and own source. So we're certainly on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Member for Frame Lake.
Look, if you guys need some extra money to get this work done by hiring a few consultants to go in and work with communities to get inventories done, please do it. Bring it forward in a supplementary appropriation so we can get this done quick. Thanks, Madam Chair. That's all I have.
Thank you. Member for Tabacha.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess my first question is, your community government share of capital formula funding and your municipal funding gap, are they based on need or per capita?
Thank you, Member. Minister of MACA.
Based on both.
Thank you. Member for Tabacha.
So if you really want to think out of the box, Madam Chair, I think the minister has to clarify what he just said, because you know, when you have a city of Yellowknife at a $58 million surplus and rising taxes for the residents, because I had a lot of people from Yellowknife tell me that the taxes were risen quite, there was a big rise in taxes here. Obviously, the capital isn't suffering. Whereas on the other hand, if we really want to address the municipal funding gap and the capital formula funding for communities and regional centers, we've got to reverse the way we think. And sometimes it takes a lot of leadership in order to make proper right decisions to address some of those gaps. And I just want to know how if the minister is willing to think out of the box and show some leadership with regards to these gaps. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member. Minister of MACA.
So we're working with N.W.T, as I said previously. We're also working with our other two territorial governments, the Nunavut and the Yukon, to reach out to the federal government to talk about this. We're working collaboratively with N.W.T and their sister organizations on a plan we're trying to address. And when we look at looking outside the box and inside the box, we are making a commitment to have the 4 programs or policies that we have, and they're going to be done this fiscal year. So it's going to be done, prepared, and working with them. So we're addressing this. We have 33 communities, and we're working with them to make sure that their needs are met where we can. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Tabacha.
Well, 32 communities are waiting for more to fill the gap, Madam Chair, and I want to know how the minister is going to address that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister of Maca.
Thank you. As I said before, we're working with N.W.T and we're working with the municipalities. We're fixing the policies. And as we move forward, we're also reaching out to the federal government. So we got a number of prongs moving forward to address this. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Tabacha.
Thank you, Madam Chair. 32 communities are not at this table to vote for this budget, though. Okay? It comes through us that, and we represent the people out there. And, I just want to make sure that those gaps are looked at seriously, because when you go around the communities and regional centers, there's a lot of infrastructure that is lacking. The municipal funding gap is there in those 32 communities, and I want to know how you're going to address that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister of Maca.
Thank you. I don't know how to make it any clearer. We're working with N.W.T. We're working, so that's 33 communities there. We are working to fix the policy. The policies, the 4 policies will be going to committee. Committee will have that opportunity to look there. We're also looking to the federal government to see if they are able to help us. We've reached out to the 2 territorial ministers already. We've had conversations. And again, as I said, we're working with N.W.T, and they're working with their sister organizations so we can work collaboratively to be able to address this. This is not a N.W.T issue. It is also Nunavut and Yukon, and so we're trying to work together with that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Member for Tabacha.
I have any further questions? I don't get a direct answer anyways. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You, member, any further questions under this member for Hay River South?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to read something out here from the information we got. It says here the department is responsible for the development and maintenance of community governments, responsive and responsible to the residents with sufficient legal authority and resources to carry out community responsibilities, to provide their public programs and services essential to good community life, and to deal effectively with other governments and organizations. The department is also responsible for protecting the interests of consumers. Madam Chair, I guess what I'm looking for is that I just want to go to the issue of flooding and MACA's, I guess, response in how they're dealing with that. Because in terms of mitigation and how that's going to be funded, how those mitigation measures will be funded for the community of Hay River, hopefully prior to next season, to avoid any other flooding, at least severe flooding. So, what are they doing? And have they identified any money? Have they for a capital budget? Because there will be berms and different initiatives that are going to be required to provide those mitigation measures. Thank you.
Thank you, member. Minister of Maca.
So we've identified $175 million for the recovery. Part of that is with the mitigation. We're also working with the federal government to see what they are able to provide us, and we're also working with other funding sources, or trying to find other funding sources to address this. So as I said on the floor today, we're working with the federal government, we're working with the town, we're working with N.W.T First Nations. So we're working together with them, but we also have to work with the federal government to be able to provide funding to us towards that. So the mitigation, again, the town of Hay River's come to us with a list. We've reached out to the federal government. We're working with the federal government on that. We're also, as I said, we set out a budget of $175 million approximately for this flood recovery for the town of Hay River and N.W.T First Nation. And so we have money right now. And as for the mitigation part, the funding, we're trying to find other sources as well. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that answer. I guess when it comes to mitigation, can you give me a sense, I guess, when you're talking about mitigation, exactly what it entails? Are we just talking about mitigation for the, for the homeowner, like lifting their homes? Or are we talking something wider, like I say, berming and maybe the buyback of land, those type of things? Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Maca.
So yeah, so it's a long list. If the committee wants it, we can provide that list. There is everything the member talked about is part of it. It's lifting homes, moving infrastructure within the homes up to another floor, looking at buyback of land and other items as well. So if that's what we have to do, then that's part of the mitigation plan process. So there is a long list, and if the member wishes to see the long list, it's not exhaustive. It could be, again, we can provide you what we have, but there could be exemptions or other stuff that we haven't thought about. And as we move, it's a living document, so it could be added. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Member for Hay River South.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate that, and I would like to see that list in case I can add anything to it, because when we talk mitigation, we're talking about within the boundaries of Hay River or N.W.T First Nation, but there's also things that we possibly could be doing outside those boundaries. So that's kind of what I'm looking for, is that making sure that the department is doing a all-encompassing assessment of how to mitigate any future damage. So, yeah, I guess I'll have further conversations with the minister on this anyway. So I guess that's more of a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Member. Are there any further comments under the Municipal and Community Affairs? Question. Member for Mafui.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, it would have been nice to have seen the numbers, since the formula is based on per capita and needs. And, like I've said it before, in my region alone, we have a lot of aging infrastructure. Our water pipe needs to be replaced. And we have a lot of buildings that are aging that needs attention as well. And it would be nice to see, the numbers, how much money is going to be spent in my region based on per capita. There's over 2,000 people in my region alone, and in Bichakwa alone is 1,900. And the smallest community is less than 200. So it would be nice to see the numbers so that so we can share this with our leaders. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Maca.
I said to YK North, we'll give you the information. We'll provide that information to you. You'll have it, and it can be made public. As I told the member previously, yes, there's aging infrastructure. Municipal governments makes decisions on their capital plan. They make decisions, and we support their decisions on how we do it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Member for Mafui.
Yes, I understand about that. Being part of a community government council, yes, I do understand about how that we can, how to spend the money, where to spend the money. But I'm just saying that right now that in my region, we have a major infrastructure issues. And it's even to change the water line that's aging, especially in Edzo, that's connected to the school, that's going to cost like over $10 million. And I don't know, like, that's why I'm saying it would be nice to see the numbers, like how much money will be allocated to my region. And it says here, regional operations, 29 million. So, and it's going to 33 communities. That's why it would be nice to see, would have been nice to see the actual number. But it's good that he's going to provide it to us, so thank you.
Thank you, member. Are there, sorry, Minister Maka.
I apologize since this number isn't going to be there. We'll make sure this is, again, for future, this will be provided in every capital plan so people are aware and so they have opportunities to look at it before us being in front of the committee. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Are there any further comments under Municipal and Community Affairs? Seeing none. Municipal and Community Affairs, Regional Operations Infrastructure Investments, $29,160,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, members. Please return now to the department summary found on page 68, Municipal and Community Affairs 2022-2023 capital estimates, $29,160,000. Member for Frame Lake.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I move that that this committee defer further consideration of the estimates for the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs at this time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The motion is on the floor and being distributed. The motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Abstentions? Motion is carried. Thank you, committee, and thank you to the minister. Sergeant at Arms, please escort the witnesses from the chamber. What's the wish of committee? Member for Frame Lake?
Madame la Présidente, I move that the chair rise and report progress.
Floor to report progress. The motion is in order and non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. I will now rise and report progress.
May I please have the report of Committee of the Whole, member for Twin Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering table document 723-192, 2023-2024 capital estimates. And I would like to report progress with 3 motions carried. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Next, we have a seconder, member for N.W.T. All those in favor? All those opposed? Oh. Motion is carried. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Thursday, October 20th, 2022, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, returns to oral questions, oral question 1163-19-2, oral question 1188-19-2, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgements, oral questions, written questions, returns to written questions, replies to the Commissioner's address, petitions, reports of committees on the review of bills, reports of standing and special committees, tabling of documents, notices of motion, motions, motion 62-19-2, motion 63-19-2, notices of motion for first reading of bills, second reading of bills, Bill 56, Bill 57, consideration in Committee of the Whole of bills and other matters, Bill 23, 29, 48, 52, 53, Committee Report 33, Committee Report 34, Table Document 723, Report of Committee of the Whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. This House stands adjourned until Thursday, October 20th, 2022 at 1:30 p.m.